The night air along the river was still warm long after the sun had gone down. Far away from the noise of modern cities, beyond electric light and crowded roads, the ancient world rested quietly beneath a sky filled with slow-moving stars. The Nile River drifted through the darkness like black glass, carrying little ripples of moonlight across its surface. Palm trees leaned softly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then became silent again. Most homes had already gone dark. Inside small mud brick houses, families rested on woven mats spread across cool floors. Clay lamps flickered low beside sleeping children. The smell of baked bread still lingered in the warm night air, mixed with dust, smoke, sweat, and river water. Workers who had spent the entire day beneath the heavy Egyptian sun now slept deeply, their tired bodies finally still after hours of carrying stone, cutting grain, shaping pottery, or rowing boats against the slow current of the Nile. Ancient Egypt often appears in history as a land of kings and monuments. People remember towering pyramids, painted tombs, gold jewelry, and enormous statues standing silently in the desert heat. But most lives in Egypt were quiet ones. Most people were not pharaohs. They were farmers waking before sunrise. Fishermen repairing nets beside muddy riverbanks. Women grinding grain into flour beneath open windows. Children carrying water jars through narrow dusty streets. Servants sweeping stone floors in silence while wealthy households slowly stirred awake. And for children, life could become serious very early. In the modern world, childhood is often imagined as a protected space. A slow season of learning, play, safety, and gentle growth. But in many parts of the 19th century, especially during the great changes brought by industry, poverty, and endless labor, childhood slowly began to disappear beneath the weight of work. Yet this change did not happen all at once. It arrived quietly. It came with factory whistles before dawn. With tired parents needing more hands to earn money. With crowded city streets full of smoke and noise. With long work days and small wages. With tiny fingers useful for repairing machines or crawling through narrow spaces. And so tonight, as the river moves softly beneath the moonlight, we travel into that fading world. A world where children woke in darkness and returned home after sunset. A world where play slowly gave way to labor. A world where exhaustion became ordinary. But to understand how childhood disappeared, it helps first to imagine life before the great machines arrived. For many centuries, most families lived close to the land. Morning began slowly in farming villages. The first sounds came from roosters calling in the dim blue light before sunrise. Then footsteps on packed earth floors. Quiet voices. Coughing from another room. The crackle of small cooking fires beginning again after the long night. Children woke beside parents and siblings in shared spaces where privacy was rare. The air inside the house often smelled of smoke, wool blankets, damp clay walls, and bread dough left rising overnight. Outside, the village slowly came alive. Women carried water from wells. Men checked animals tied near small fences. Oxen shifted lazily in the early light. Thin streams of smoke curled upward into pale morning skies. Children had work to do even then. A young boy might guide goats into nearby fields while the air remained cool. A girl might help grind grain beside her mother, turning heavy stones hour after hour. Some children gathered sticks for cooking fires. Others carried baskets, fed chickens, cleaned tools, or watched younger brothers and sisters while adults worked. Life was not easy. But for many rural families, work and home remained connected. Children stayed close to parents. Labor followed the rhythm of seasons, weather, and daylight. There were moments of rest beneath trees during the hottest hours. Quiet evenings beside the fire. Festivals after harvests. Long winter nights filled with storytelling and candlelight. The pace of life, though difficult, still moved with nature. Then slowly, during the 18th and 19th centuries, the world began to change. Factories rose beside rivers. Tall brick buildings filled growing cities with smoke and noise. Iron machines clattered day and night. Steam engines breathed clouds into gray skies. Crowded streets filled with carts, horses, laborers, and children moving through mud and ash. For poor families, the city promised work. And so many left behind fields, farms, and villages. They arrived carrying blankets, tools, pots, babies, and whatever little money they possessed. Some traveled for days on rough roads. Others crowded onto riverboats or wagons. Children walked beside exhausted parents beneath cold rain or burning summer heat. At first, the cities must have felt enormous. The streets smelled of coal smoke, horse manure, sewage, sweat, and wet stone. Windows crowded closely together above narrow alleys where sunlight barely reached the ground. Laundry hung overhead between buildings. Water dripped from rooftops after rain. And everywhere there was noise. Metal striking metal. Factory whistles. Wheels rattling over stone roads. Men shouting near docks. Babies crying through thin apartment walls. The city never seemed completely quiet. Families often rented tiny rooms in crowded buildings where many people lived side by side. Several children might sleep together beneath one blanket. Air inside the rooms became thick during summer nights. In winter, cold drafts slipped through cracks in walls and windows. Many fathers worked long hours lifting cargo, digging canals, building railroads, or operating dangerous machinery. Women found work sewing clothing, washing laundry, preparing food, or cleaning wealthier homes. But often the wages were not enough. And slowly, more and more children entered the workforce beside adults. Some were only 6 or 7 years old. Before dawn, tired children climbed from beds while darkness still covered the streets outside. Their bodies ached from the previous day's labor. Small hands rubbed tired eyes. Cold water splashed across sleepy faces. Breakfast was simple if it existed at all. A crust of bread. Thin porridge. Perhaps weak tea. Then they stepped outside into cold morning air and walked toward factories through streets already filling with workers. In textile mills, children operated spinning machines surrounded by endless noise. The sound inside these buildings never truly stopped. Hundreds of machines clicked, rattled, spun, and thundered together beneath heavy ceilings darkened by smoke and dust. The air felt hot and thick. Tiny fibers floated everywhere, entering lungs and settling into hair and clothing. Windows often remained shut to protect delicate threads from outside moisture and wind. Children moved quickly between machines. Their small size made them useful. They crawled beneath spinning frames to clear debris. They repaired snapped threads using careful fingers. They ran errands across factory floors slick with oil and dirt. Many worked 12 or 14 hours each day. Some worked longer. As daylight faded outside, gas lamps flickered inside the factory, casting pale yellow light across tired faces. Children struggled to stay awake while machines continued roaring around them. A single mistake could be dangerous. Loose clothing caught in gears. Fingers crushed between rollers. Hair pulled into spinning wheels. In the exhaustion of endless labor, accidents happened quietly and often. Yet the work continued. Factory owners valued speed and discipline. Bells marked the beginning of shifts. Late arrivals lost wages. Talking too much could bring punishment. Falling asleep beside machines sometimes brought beatings or dismissal. And still, families depended on every small coin children carried home at night. Back in crowded apartments, evenings remained short. A mother might patch torn clothing beside candlelight while children ate soup from worn bowls. Fathers returned home covered in soot and dust. Boots rested near doors beside damp coats and work tools. Sometimes nobody spoke very much. The body becomes quiet after too much labor. Children often fell asleep almost immediately after eating, still wearing work clothes, their hands rough long before adulthood. Outside, the city remained restless. Factory smoke drifted beneath moonlight. Horses pulled wagons through dark streets. Somewhere nearby, another child prepared to wake again in only a few hours. As industrial life spread across Europe and America, ideas about childhood slowly changed. Before factories, children had certainly worked. Most families throughout history needed every member to contribute. But industrial labor separated children from home in new ways. Work became more mechanical, more disciplined, more endless. Time itself changed. Factory clocks ruled the day now. Not sunrise. Not seasons. Not weather. Children learned to move according to whistles and schedules instead of natural rhythms. Morning came not with birdsong or sunlight, but with the sound of bells echoing through cold streets before dawn. Inside coal mines, conditions became even harsher. Young boys and girls crawled through narrow underground tunnels where adults could not fit. Their small bodies hauled heavy carts filled with coal across wet stone paths deep beneath the earth. Down there, sunlight disappeared entirely. The air smelled of dirt, smoke, damp rock, and sweat. Water dripped constantly from ceilings. Tiny lamps flickered weakly in the darkness. Some children spent nearly the entire day underground. They breathed coal dust until coughing became normal. Muscles hardened early from pulling heavy loads through cramped passages. Many worked barefoot in cold mud because shoes were expensive. Far above them, the world continued quietly. Rain crossed green hills. Rivers flowed beneath bridges. Birds moved through cloudy skies. But underground, time felt different. Long hours passed slowly in darkness broken only by dim lantern light and the scrape of wheels against stone. When shifts finally ended, children emerged covered in black dust, blinking beneath pale evening skies. Some were too tired even to speak during the walk home. Others fell asleep while eating supper. And still, many families believed there was no other choice. Poverty leaves little room for rest. In wealthier homes, childhood looked very different. Middle and upper-class families slowly developed new ideas about education, innocence, and protection. Their children often spent more time studying literature, practicing music, or learning manners beneath careful supervision. Nurseries appeared in larger homes. Private tutors taught reading and writing. Soft dresses and sailor suits became symbols of childhood itself. But these comforts belonged mostly to families with money. For working children, life remained shaped by labor. In crowded workshops, young apprentices learned trades beneath strict masters. Boys hammered metal in blacksmith shops where sparks floated through hot air. Girls stitched clothing in dim sewing rooms until candle flames burned low late at night. Even in homes, labor never truly stopped. Water needed carrying. Floors needed scrubbing. Food needed preparing. Younger children needed watching. A girl of 10 might already know how to bake bread, wash laundry, mend clothing, clean wounds, calm crying babies, and prepare evening meals while adults worked elsewhere. Many children matured quietly through necessity. Their hands became skilled early. Their posture changed. Their voices grew serious. And slowly, society began expecting less play and more usefulness from them. At night, cities settled only slightly. The loudest factory sounds faded after midnight, but silence rarely arrived completely. Somewhere in the darkness, footsteps echoed across stone alleys. Drunken voices drifted through fog. Rain tapped softly against windows blackened by soot. Inside overcrowded rooms, families slept close together beneath rough blankets. Children dreamed beside the sounds of coughing adults, creaking floors, distant wagon wheels, and wind slipping through broken shutters. Morning always returned too quickly. For some children, school existed only briefly or not at all. Education cost time. And time meant wages. A family surviving week to week could not easily spare a child for classrooms instead of factories. Even where schools existed, attendance remained irregular for many poor families. Harvest seasons, illness, and work schedules often interrupted learning. Some children learned letters slowly by candlelight after exhausting workdays. Others never learned to read at all. Still, moments of childhood survived in quiet ways. A game played beside factory walls during short meal breaks. A song whispered while carrying water. Small laughter echoing briefly through crowded alleys. Children still chased stray dogs through dusty streets. They still collected stones beside rivers and drew shapes in dirt with sticks. They still watched snow fall through cracked windows with wide tired eyes. Even during hard years, small pockets of wonder remained. And perhaps that made the loss feel even more painful. Because childhood did not vanish suddenly. It faded slowly beneath survival. Parents often loved their children deeply. Many feared the dangerous conditions surrounding them. Mothers worried when tiny sons disappeared underground into mines before sunrise. Fathers returned home carrying injured children after factory accidents. Families mourned quietly when sickness spread through crowded neighborhoods. But hunger pressed heavily against every decision. The 19th century was also an age of illness. Cities grew faster than sanitation systems could handle. Dirty water carried disease through crowded districts. Tuberculosis, cholera, influenza, and infections moved quickly among families living close together in damp buildings with little ventilation. Children became sick often. A fever could spread through an entire household within days. Mothers stayed awake through long nights beside coughing children while candles burned low beside beds. Doctors were expensive and not always helpful. Home remedies filled small kitchens with the smells of herbs, vinegar, broth, and boiled cloth. Sometimes children recovered slowly. Sometimes they did not. And yet the factories continued running. The whistles still sounded before dawn. Workers still crossed bridges through cold fog carrying lunch pails and tools. The city rarely paused for grief. Far from industrial centers, rural life also changed under economic pressure. Farms struggled against shifting markets and growing populations. Poor harvests brought debt. Families worked harder for smaller returns. Children in farming communities continued laboring from early ages. Before sunrise they milked cows in cold barns where breath floated white in freezing air. They gathered eggs, chopped wood, repaired fences, hauled hay, and planted crops beneath endless summer heat. During harvest seasons, entire families moved together through fields from morning until dusk. The work was slow and physical. Hands blistered. Backs ached. Dust clung to sweaty skin. At night, Exhausted children slept deeply beneath heavy quilts while crickets sang outside open windows. Life there could still contain moments of softness. The quiet rhythm of rain on rooftops. Warm soup after cold mornings. The smell of bread cooling beside wooden tables. But even rural childhood carried growing expectations of labor and responsibility. As the century moved forward, reformers slowly began noticing the suffering surrounding working children. Writers described dark factories and dangerous mines. Journalists visited crowded neighborhoods where families struggled to survive on tiny wages. Photographers captured tired young faces standing beside enormous machines. Some people argued children deserved protection. Others insisted families needed the income. And so debates moved through newspapers, churches, government halls, and dinner tables. But change arrived slowly. For many children, daily life remained unchanged for years. Wake before dawn. Walk to work. Labor until exhaustion. Return home. Sleep. Repeat. And through all of it, the atmosphere of the 19th century wrapped itself around ordinary lives like smoke settling over rooftops. Coal fires burned endlessly. Rain turned roads into mud. Gas lamps flickered beside wet cobblestones. Laundry froze stiff during winter mornings. Summer heat trapped foul air inside narrow apartments. In harbor cities, fog rolled slowly between ships while fishermen repaired nets beside cold water before sunrise. In factory towns, soot settled across windowsills like dark snow. In mining villages, the earth itself seemed stained black from endless labor underground. Children moved quietly through all these places. Some barefoot. Some carrying tools nearly as large as their arms. Some still half asleep beneath gray morning skies. And somewhere far away from the noise of cities, the Nile River still moved gently through the ancient darkness. Water touched reeds along the shore with soft rhythmic sounds. Warm wind crossed mud brick villages where oil lamps glowed faintly behind woven curtains. Farmers slept before another long day beneath the sun. History often folds different worlds together in strange ways. Ancient labor. Industrial labor. Fields. Factories. Riverbanks. Coal mines. And through every age, ordinary people waking early to work until nightfall. Especially the young. Especially the poor. The stars above remained calm and silent while generations passed beneath them. And in the quiet hours before dawn, childhood slowly became shorter and shorter beneath the weight of the working world. Before sunrise, the city often felt softer. For a short moment, before factory whistles pierced the morning air, the streets rested in a kind of gray silence. Thin fog drifted between brick buildings. Rainwater collected in uneven stones along narrow roads. A few lanterns still glowed outside bakeries where workers had already begun kneading dough in warm kitchens filled with flour dust and steam. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet earth. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifted impatiently beside a wagon loaded with sacks of grain. Farther down the street, a woman wrapped in a wool shawl hurried through the cold carrying a small basket against her chest. Her footsteps echoed softly against stone walls darkened by years of soot. Inside crowded apartments above those streets, children slowly woke from uneasy sleep. The rooms were often small enough that everyone heard everyone else breathing during the night. Babies cried. Someone coughed in the darkness. Beds creaked whenever a tired body turned beneath rough blankets. Many homes had only one room. Parents and children slept side by side on straw mattresses laid directly on wooden floors. Sometimes several children shared a single blanket while cold air slipped through cracks around old windows. In winter, mornings could feel especially difficult. Children pulled stiff clothing over tired bodies while frost covered the corners of glass panes. Water inside metal basins felt painfully cold against sleepy skin. Some families warmed yesterday's soup over weak fires before leaving for work. Others simply ate dry bread while standing near the door. Then, little by little, the city awakened. Factory bells rang through the darkness. Workers stepped into the streets. And long lines of children moved quietly beside them. Many carried lunch wrapped in cloth. Some wore shoes too worn to keep out rainwater. Others walked barefoot through mud during warmer months. Their faces looked pale in the early morning light. No one moved very quickly. Exhaustion already rested heavily on them before the workday had even begun. As the sun slowly rose behind rows of chimneys, smoke drifted upward into skies already turning gray. The factory buildings themselves appeared enormous to children approaching them each morning. Tall windows reflected weak sunlight. Brick walls stretched across entire city blocks. Steam escaped from pipes with long hissing sounds. Inside, the noise waited. The moment work began, conversations disappeared beneath the thunder of machines. In textile mills, spinning frames shook endlessly across crowded rooms. Belts turned overhead. Metal parts clattered together in endless rhythm. Dust floated through warm air thick enough to taste. Children learned quickly how to survive inside those spaces. Some tied cloth around their mouths to keep fibers from entering their lungs. Others rubbed sore hands during short meal breaks before returning to work. Young boys darted between machines carrying tools or bundles of thread while older workers shouted instructions they could barely hear above the noise. Time moved strangely there. Hours blended together beneath artificial light and endless repetition. Children repaired broken threads again and again until their fingers moved almost automatically. The body continued working even while the mind drifted elsewhere. Perhaps toward rivers far from the city. Perhaps toward fields remembered from early childhood. Perhaps nowhere at all. Sometimes the windows fogged from heat and moisture inside the mill, hiding the outside world completely. Workers could not easily tell whether rain was falling or sunlight had appeared beyond the walls. Only the bells mattered. Bells for beginning work. Bells for meals. Bells for ending shifts. The rhythm of life narrowed into those sounds. In some factories, very young children served as scavengers. They crawled beneath dangerous machinery to collect loose cotton or repair tangled parts while the machines still moved overhead. It was frightening work, though fear often became familiar after enough time passed. The older workers sometimes watched carefully, worried for the children moving beneath spinning gears and heavy wheels. But production rarely stopped. Machines were expensive. Time was valuable. And poor families needed wages immediately, not someday in the future. Far from the mills, in neighborhoods beside rivers and ports, other children worked outdoors through changing weather. Newsboys crossed crowded streets carrying stacks of newspapers beneath their arms, calling headlines through morning fog. Shoe shiners sat beside sidewalks polishing leather boots while cold wind moved through the city. Young girls sold flowers near train stations where travelers rushed past without slowing down. Some children hauled water. Some cleaned stables. Some swept factory floors after shifts ended late at night. The city depended upon invisible labor carried by small tired bodies. Even in wealthier districts, children often worked as servants inside large homes filled with polished furniture and quiet hallways. A young maid might wake before everyone else to light fires in cold rooms before dawn. She carried buckets of coal upstairs while the house remained silent. Later she scrubbed floors on her knees, washed laundry in steaming water, prepared vegetables in basement kitchens, and answered bells rung by family members she rarely spoke to directly. The work followed her from morning into night. Yet inside those large homes, another kind of childhood existed only a few rooms away. Children from wealthy families slept beneath soft blankets in quiet bedrooms decorated with painted toys and bookshelves. They studied piano beside sunny windows. They practiced reading while tutors corrected pronunciation gently. They walked through gardens wearing clean clothes untouched by factory dust or coal smoke. The distance between these childhoods could exist inside the very same building. One child carried ash from fireplaces. Another practiced handwriting beside candlelight. One returned home exhausted. Another spent afternoons playing quietly beneath trees. And still, both belonged to the same century. Outside the cities, long roads crossed farming regions where labor began just as early. The countryside often appeared peaceful from a distance. Rolling hills beneath morning mist. Narrow rivers cutting through green fields. Stone cottages surrounded by gardens and chickens scratching quietly in the dirt. But rural life demanded constant work. Children woke before sunrise to milk cows while barns still felt cold and dark. They carried heavy pails across muddy yards where frost covered the ground during winter months. In summer, heat rose early over fields buzzing with insects. During planting seasons, families worked together from dawn until evening. Hands pushed seeds into soil. Boots sank into wet earth. Sweat-soaked clothing beneath endless sunlight. Children learned to move beside adults without complaint because the work simply needed doing. Crops depended upon timing. Weather could change suddenly. Delays meant hunger later. A young boy might spend entire afternoons guiding oxen through fields while dust clung to his face and neck. A girl might stand beside wash tubs for hours scrubbing clothing until her fingers turned raw from soap and cold water. Yet the countryside also carried long stretches of quiet. Birdsong drifted across fields in the early morning. Wind moved gently through tall grass. After sunset, darkness arrived slowly over farms where lantern light glowed softly through windows. Children there still found brief moments for themselves. Skipping stones across streams. Climbing trees during short rests. Watching clouds drift overhead while lying in warm grass after long workdays. But even those moments felt temporary. Responsibility always returned. As the 19th century continued, many adults began speaking differently about children. Writers, teachers, doctors, and religious leaders slowly argued that childhood should be protected. They described innocence as something delicate, something easily damaged by harsh labor and crowded industrial life. Books for children became more common. Schools expanded in certain places. Some governments discussed laws limiting child labor. But ideas moved more slowly than poverty. In poor neighborhoods, survival still mattered most. A family struggling to pay rent could not always choose education over wages. If a child earned even a small amount each week, that money might buy bread, coal, medicine, or shoes for younger siblings. And so many parents faced impossible decisions quietly, without anger or speeches. A mother might watch her son leave for factory work before sunrise and feel sadness mixed with relief because his wages helped keep the family alive. A father injured at work might depend entirely upon older children to support the household while he recovered. Love and hardship lived together constantly. At night, families gathered in whatever warmth they could create. Small fires burned low in crowded rooms. Soup simmered slowly in iron pots. Wet clothing hung near heat to dry before morning. Tired children rested their heads against walls while parents spoke quietly about bills, work, food prices, or illness spreading nearby. Outside, winter rain tapped softly against rooftops. Or summer heat lingered long after sunset, trapping heavy air inside narrow streets where open windows offered little relief. In some neighborhoods, music drifted faintly from taverns while workers tried briefly to escape exhaustion. Somewhere farther away, church bells marked the passing hours across sleeping districts. The city never became completely silent. Even deep into the night, footsteps echoed across stone roads. Horses pulled wagons beneath dim gas lamps. Factory smoke continued rising slowly into darkness. And before long, morning returned again. For children working in mines, mornings barely mattered because daylight itself became distant. Many mining villages sat beneath hills scarred by black entrances leading underground. Small houses crowded close together near pits surrounded by carts, ropes, and machinery stained dark with coal dust. The entire landscape seemed covered in gray. Children walked toward the mines carrying tiny lamps before dawn while cold winds swept across muddy roads. Some descended deep underground inside narrow lifts creaking slowly into darkness. The deeper they traveled, the warmer and heavier the air became. Soon sunlight disappeared entirely. Underground tunnels stretched endlessly through rock and shadow. Water dripped from ceilings into puddles along uneven ground. Coal dust coated skin, lungs, clothing, even food carried for meals. Children worked in spaces so narrow they could barely stand upright. Some opened and closed ventilation doors hour after hour in darkness broken only by weak lantern light. Others dragged coal carts through tight passages where the air felt difficult to breathe. Silence rarely existed underground either. Wheels scraped against rails. Tools struck stone. Men shouted through tunnels. Coughing echoed constantly. And always there was the feeling of earth pressing heavily above. When shifts ended, children emerged blinking into pale daylight covered head to toe in black dust. Their faces looked older somehow after hours spent underground. Their shoulders slumped with exhaustion as they walked home through villages where smoke drifted from chimneys into cold evening skies. Many slept deeply without dreaming. The body sometimes chooses silence when too tired to imagine anything else. Illness followed working children everywhere. Factory air damaged lungs slowly over years. Dangerous machinery caused injuries that never fully healed. Poor nutrition weakened growing bodies already strained by endless labor. In crowded city housing, diseases spread rapidly through damp rooms where entire families lived close together. Doctors described children who looked smaller than their age. Thin arms. Bent backs. Persistent coughs. Tired eyes. Yet many still returned to work day after day because there was no real alternative waiting for them. Sometimes reformers visited factories and mines to witness conditions themselves. They walked through noisy rooms observing children operating dangerous machines. They entered crowded apartments where entire families survived inside spaces hardly larger than storage rooms. Some wrote reports filled with concern. Others sketched scenes of exhausted young workers resting beside factory walls. Gradually, public opinion began shifting. But change remained uneven and slow. One city might pass new labor laws while another continued operating much as before. Some factory owners reduced working hours slightly. Others ignored regulations whenever possible. And throughout it all, ordinary life continued quietly. A girl carrying bread home at sunset. A boy asleep beside a stable after cleaning horses all day. Children laughing briefly beside puddles after rain despite everything surrounding them. Human life rarely becomes only suffering. Even during the hardest years, people still searched for comfort. Warm tea shared beside candlelight. Stories whispered before sleep. Hands resting gently on tired shoulders. Mothers brushing dust from children's hair after long shifts. Fathers carrying sleeping sons upstairs after supper. These small moments mattered deeply because they interrupted the harshness surrounding daily life. And perhaps childhood survived longest inside those moments. Not inside laws. Not inside schools. But inside tenderness itself. A quiet song before bed. A blanket pulled carefully over sleeping children. A simple meal shared together after exhausting work. Outside, history continued moving forward. Railroads stretched across countries. Factories multiplied beside rivers. Cities expanded beneath smoke-filled skies. More machines. More workers. More speed. The 19th century carried enormous energy, but ordinary people often experienced it as fatigue. Long hours. Endless noise. Heavy air. Repetition. Especially the young. And still, beneath the exhaustion, the world remained strangely beautiful at times. Snow falling softly across silent factory rooftops before dawn. Moonlight touching frozen streets after midnight. River water reflecting lanterns beside crowded docks. The smell of fresh bread drifting through dark alleys early in the morning. Children notice these things too. Even tired children. Especially tired children. Because when life becomes difficult, small peaceful moments often shine more brightly. Far away from the industrial cities, warm winds still crossed ancient deserts beneath endless stars. River water moved slowly through reeds along quiet shores. Mud brick homes rested beneath moonlight while families slept beside flickering oil lamps. Different centuries. Different worlds. Yet always the same human rhythm. Work. Rest. Hunger. Warmth. Exhaustion. Love. And children growing older much too quickly beneath the steady movement of history. By the middle of the 19th century, the sound of machines had become part of daily life in many cities. People woke to it, worked beside it, fell asleep while it still echoed faintly through distant streets. Even the air itself seemed shaped by industry. Smoke drifted slowly over rooftops from hundreds of chimneys burning coal day and night. Fine ash settled onto window sills, clothing, and skin. Rain mixed with soot and turned roads dark with mud. The smell of damp brick, steam, smoke, and horse sweat lingered almost everywhere. And through all of it, children continued moving quietly among adults, carrying burdens that once belonged mostly to grown men and women. Before dawn, narrow alleys filled again with footsteps. A small boy wrapped in a worn coat hurried beside his older sister through cold morning fog. Neither spoke very much. Their breath drifted white into the darkness while distant factory whistles called workers toward another long day. In some neighborhoods, entire families walked together before sunrise. Fathers carried metal lunch tins. Mothers pulled shawls tightly against the cold. Children rubbed tired eyes while trying not to stumble across uneven stones. The city around them still looked half asleep. Windows remained dark. Cats slipped silently between piles of crates near market streets. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang slowly through the mist. Then, little by little, the factories came alive. Steam hissed from pipes. Huge belts began turning overhead. Iron wheels trembled into motion. Inside spinning mills, rows of machines stretched farther than many children could clearly see through the floating dust. Gas lamps flickered against damp walls while supervisors paced between workers already bent over their tasks. The noise inside these buildings could feel endless. Conversation became difficult. Thought itself sometimes felt swallowed by the constant rattling and pounding of machinery. Children adapted the way people often do when surrounded by something every day. The noise became part of the body. Some workers later said that silence itself felt strange after years inside factories. Young children learned quickly where to stand and where not to stand. They memorized the dangerous rhythm of gears and belts. They understood which supervisors punished mistakes harshly and which older workers might quietly help them during difficult moments. Many children worked with incredible concentration simply because accidents could happen so suddenly. A loose sleeve. A moment of distraction. A tired hand moving too slowly. The machines never grew tired. Only people did. Meal breaks arrived briefly in the middle of long shifts. Workers sat together on wooden floors or beside brick walls eating simple food carried from home. Bread. Potatoes. Cold tea. Thin soup if they were fortunate. Children often ate quietly. Some rested their heads against walls for a few precious minutes before the bells rang again. Others rubbed sore fingers or coughed into cloth darkened by dust. Outside, sunlight crossed the city unnoticed by those still working indoors. Clouds moved overhead. Rain fell softly against factory windows. Birds settled briefly on rooftops blackened by smoke. But inside, time remained trapped beneath artificial light and endless motion. For children working outdoors, the rhythm of labor followed the streets themselves. In market districts, young boys pushed carts loaded with vegetables over whetstones while merchants shouted prices through cold morning air. Girls carried baskets filled with bread or laundry through crowded lanes where horses splashed muddy water onto their skirts. Some children sold matches. Some swept crossing paths for coins. Some stood beside docks waiting for temporary work unloading cargo from riverboats. The docks could feel especially alive at sunrise. Ships creaked gently against wooden piers while fog rolled low across dark water. Sailors shouted to one another while ropes lapped softly against tall masts. The smell of salt water mixed with fish, wet wood, coal smoke, and tar. Children there learned to move carefully around heavy cargo and hurried adults. Small hands carried crates, coiled ropes, cleaned tools, and fetched supplies. Seagulls circled overhead crying into gray skies while waves touched the harbor walls below. By evening, exhaustion settled over the waterfront like another layer of mist. Workers sat beside warehouses eating late suppers in silence. Children curled against sacks of grain or piles of rope while waiting for parents to finish loading ships beneath flickering lantern light. Many drifted asleep before even reaching home. In wealthier parts of the city, life moved differently. The streets were often wider there. Buildings stood cleaner. Curtains hung neatly inside tall windows glowing warmly during the evening hours. Carriages rolled more quietly over smoother roads lined with trees and iron fences. Children from wealthy families sometimes walked those streets holding books beneath their arms on the way to lessons or schools. Their childhoods were shaped less by labor and more by preparation. Preparation for adulthood. For education. For society. Girls practiced piano in quiet sitting rooms filled with candlelight and polished furniture. Boys studied maps, handwriting, mathematics, and history beside fireplaces crackling softly during winter afternoons. Nurses and servants cared for many daily needs behind the scenes. And often those servants were still children themselves. A young maid might stand silently near the dining room wall while another child her same age practiced music nearby. One child served tea. The other learned French pronunciation from a tutor. Their lives existed close together and impossibly far apart at the same time. The 19th century held these contrasts everywhere. Comfort beside hardship. Warmth beside exhaustion. Childhood preserved for some while slowly disappearing for others. In rural villages, labor carried a different pace, though it remained just as demanding. Morning arrived slowly over fields covered in mist. Roosters crowed near barns where lanterns already glowed faintly in the darkness. Farmers stepped into cold air pulling heavy boots through mud dampened by dew. Children followed close behind. The countryside smelled of hay, wet soil, smoke from cooking fires, and animals waiting to be fed. Wooden fences creaked softly in the wind. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently inside stalls while cows shifted heavily against fresh straw. There was always something needing attention. Water to carry. Wood to chop. Eggs to gather. Fields to weed. Animals to clean and feed. During harvest seasons, entire days disappeared beneath endless repetitive motion. Children bent over crops beneath hot sunlight while insects buzzed lazily through thick summer air. Dust clung to sweaty faces and necks. Muscles ached long before evening finally arrived. Yet rural nights could feel deeply peaceful after the labor ended. Families gathered beside candlelight while darkness spread quietly across the fields outside. Soup simmered slowly over fires. Wind moved through trees beyond small windows glowing warmly against the night. Children sometimes listened to stories while half asleep beneath blankets. Older relatives spoke softly about difficult winters, distant relatives, old harvests, floods, illnesses, marriages, and births. These moments carried a kind of slowness already disappearing from industrial cities. But even there, childhood rarely lasted long. A farm depended upon labor just as factories did. By 10 or 12 years old, many rural children already worked with the endurance of adults. Their hands roughened early. Their posture changed from lifting, carrying, planting, and cleaning day after day. Responsibility arrived quietly and stayed. Meanwhile, the idea of protecting childhood continued growing among reformers and writers. Some teachers argued that education should replace labor for young children. Religious leaders spoke about innocence and moral development. Doctors warned that endless factory work damaged growing bodies permanently. Books and paintings from the period sometimes showed childhood as gentle and pure. Children running through green fields. Reading peacefully beside windows. Sleeping safely beneath soft blankets. But these images reflected hope more than reality for many working families. In crowded districts where wages barely covered food and rent, childhood remained tied closely to survival. A child who worked brought income. A child who stayed home often meant another hungry mouth to feed. Parents carried this burden silently. Many already worked until their own bodies ached constantly. Mothers scrubbed laundry until their hands cracked from cold water and soap. Fathers returned home limping from construction sites, mines, railroads, or docks. The exhaustion inside working-class homes could feel almost physical in the evenings. People moved more slowly after sunset. Voices softened. Even arguments sometimes faded beneath simple fatigue. Children often fell asleep near fires before meals fully ended. Mothers lifted them gently onto mattresses without waking them completely. Boots remained beside doors covered in mud or coal dust ready for morning. Outside, rain tapped against rooftops. Or snow drifted silently through narrow streets beneath gas lamps glowing pale gold in the darkness. Winter could be especially hard for poor families. Cold air slipped through broken windows and thin walls. Coal cost money many families barely possessed. Damp clothing rarely dried completely in crowded rooms filled with too many people and too little heat. Children walked to work before sunrise while snow gathered along sidewalks and rooftops. Fingers stiffened from cold. Shoes leaked icy water. Breath floated through the darkness while factory whistles echoed through sleeping neighborhoods. Inside mills and workshops, however, the air often became hot and heavy from machinery and crowded bodies. Workers moved suddenly from freezing streets into rooms thick with steam, dust, and noise. The body adjusted constantly between extremes. Illness spread easily in those conditions. Coughing became ordinary. So did fever. So did fatigue lingering week after week without fully disappearing. Many children worked while sick simply because missing work meant losing wages. Some wrapped scarves around sore throats and continued through long shifts anyway. Others leaned against walls during breaks trying quietly to gather strength before the next bell rang. Still, moments of tenderness survived inside these difficult lives. A mother warming cold hands beside a stove before her child left for work. An older brother carrying a sleeping younger sister home through dark streets. Workers sharing bread during short meal breaks. Neighbors caring for sick children while parents labored elsewhere. Human beings continued creating small islands of care inside exhausting worlds. And children noticed kindness deeply because hardship surrounded them so often. Sometimes the smallest comforts became unforgettable. The warmth of soup after working outside in winter rain. Fresh socks dried near a fire. Clean sheets after weeks of labor. A quiet song heard through an open window while walking home at night. The 19th century moved quickly in some ways and painfully slowly in others. Railroads spread across continents. Steamships crossed oceans faster than ever before. Factories multiplied. Cities expanded outward endlessly. But inside ordinary homes, daily life still centered around simple needs. Food. Eat. Work. Rest. Children grew older within those routines almost without realizing it. A young boy might begin carrying tools for workers at age 7. By 13 he already moved with the tired posture of an adult laborer. A girl helping care for younger siblings at age 8 might manage an entire household before reaching adulthood herself. There was rarely a clear moment when childhood ended. Instead it slowly faded beneath responsibility. The process happened quietly enough that many people barely noticed it while living through it. Days simply became fuller with work. Play became shorter. Voices grew more serious. Sleep became more necessary. And eventually childhood existed mostly in memory. At night, after long shifts finally ended, some children still wandered briefly through the streets before returning home. They watched reflections shimmer across puddles beneath gas lamps. They listened to distant music drifting from taverns or dance halls meant for adults. They smelled bread cooling inside bakeries preparing for morning. Cities looked softer after midnight. The noise faded slightly. Fog rolled slowly between buildings. Even factory chimneys seemed quieter beneath moonlight. The night air beside the Nile River felt warm. Even the industrial world rested. Then somewhere in the darkness, another bell rang softly. A baker beginning work. A dock preparing early cargo. A train arriving through cold mist. Morning approaching once again. And in tiny crowded rooms across the city, children slept heavily beside tired parents while the next day waited patiently outside the window. In the quiet hours just before dawn, the city sometimes felt almost gentle again. The smoke hanging above the rooftops softened beneath pale moonlight. Rainwater reflected the dim glow of gas lamps along empty streets. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rattled slowly over stone roads while horses breathed clouds into the cold morning air. Most windows remained dark. Families still slept inside narrow brick buildings where entire lives unfolded within only a few crowded rooms. Children curled beneath worn blankets beside brothers, sisters, parents, and sometimes grandparents too. The air indoors carried the familiar smell of damp wool, candle smoke, old wood, and yesterday's cooking fire. For a little while longer, there was silence. But soon the city would wake again. And with it, thousands of children would rise into another day shaped by labor. Some children woke easily from habit. Their bodies had learned the rhythm of factory life so completely that they stirred even before the whistles sounded. Others struggled to open their eyes after only a few hours of sleep. A mother might kneel beside a mattress in the darkness and whisper softly for her children to wake. A small candle flickered nearby, throwing weak golden light against cracked walls. Outside the window, fog drifted low through the street. The children dressed quietly. Buttons fastened with cold fingers. Boots pulled onto aching feet. Scarves wrapped against winter air. Then the family stepped outside together into the dark. The street slowly filled with movement. Workers crossed bridges over black rivers reflecting factory lights. Groups of children hurried beside older siblings or parents while trying to stay warm beneath thin coats. Some carried pieces of bread to eat during the walk. Others kept their hands tucked beneath their arms against the cold. The city smelled different before sunrise. Fresh bread from bakeries mixed with coal smoke drifting from chimneys already burning for the day ahead. Wet stone, horse manure, river fog, and steam from factory pipes filled the air together. Everything felt damp. Even sound itself seemed softer in the mist. Then came the whistles. Long mechanical cries echoing across rooftops. The workday had begun again. Inside textile mills, gas lamps burned against the darkness because sunlight had not yet fully arrived. Workers entered crowded rooms where machines already trembled with motion. The floors shook faintly beneath endless rows of spinning frames. Children moved quickly to their places. Some stood on wooden boxes because they were too small to comfortably reach the machines. Others hurried along narrow aisles carrying thread, tools, or baskets filled with cotton. The work demanded attention every moment. Thread snapped constantly. Fibers tangled. Machines jammed. Dust settled into eyes and throats. Children learned not only how to work, but how to endure the endless repetition. Hands moved automatically after enough months passed. Minds drifted elsewhere while bodies continued their tasks. Many children thought often about sleep, about warm beds, about sunlight, about fields or rivers they barely remembered from earlier years. Sometimes exhaustion became so deep that workers entered strange dreamlike states while still awake. The constant movement of machinery blurred together with the floating dust and flickering gaslight until the entire room seemed distant and unreal. Yet the supervisors remained alert. Time was money inside factories. A child slowing down too much might hear sharp words immediately. Some factories fined workers for lateness or mistakes. Others punished children physically. Fear mixed with fatigue and became part of daily life. Still, children found ways to help one another quietly. An older girl might repair a younger child's torn sleeve during a short break. A boy who finished his own task early might secretly help another worker struggling nearby. Someone shared extra bread. Someone offered water. Someone whispered encouragement during difficult hours. Kindness survived in small hidden ways. Outside the factories, city streets carried their own rhythm of labor. Markets opened early beneath gray skies. Vendors arranged vegetables on wooden tables still wet from overnight rain. Fish sellers unpacked their catches while cold air drifted through narrow lanes smelling of salt water and mud. Children worked there too. Young boys pushed heavy carts through crowded streets while shouting warnings to pedestrians. Girls carried baskets of fruit balanced carefully against their hips. Some children cleaned market stalls after closing, sweeping spoiled vegetables, straw, and mud into piles beneath fading lantern light. The markets changed with the seasons. In winter, cold winds moved through the open spaces while workers stamped their feet for warmth. During summer, heat settled heavily over the streets. Flies gathered around fish and meat while sweat soaked through clothing before noon. Children experienced all of it. The noise. The smells. The exhaustion. The endless movement of goods and people through the city. Along the riverfront, another world unfolded each day. Ships arrived carrying coal, grain, timber, fabric, and machinery from distant places. Sailors shouted from decks while ropes tightened against wooden posts slick with rainwater. The river itself moved slowly beneath cloudy skies reflecting smoke from factories built along its banks. Children working near the docks often rose even earlier than factory workers. The harbor never truly slept. Cargo needed unloading at all hours. Fishing boats returned before sunrise. Markets demanded fresh goods immediately. Small boys carried messages between warehouses. Others swept loading areas or stacked crates taller than themselves. Some worked beside fishermen, helping untangle nets stiff with salt and river mud. The work left strong smells clinging to clothing. Fish. Wet rope. Coal dust. River water. Tar. At the end of long days, children returned home carrying those smells with them into crowded apartments where laundry already hung drying beside weak fires. In mining towns, mornings looked darker still. Coal dust covered roads, rooftops, fences, even the snow during winter months. The sky above many mining villages seemed permanently gray from smoke drifting upward day and night. Children walked toward the mines carrying tiny lamps through cold pre-dawn air. Their footsteps crunched across frozen mud while distant machinery groaned slowly in the darkness. Then they disappeared underground. The mines felt like another world entirely. Narrow tunnels stretched deep beneath the earth where sunlight never reached. The air smelled damp and heavy. Water dripped constantly from stone ceilings. Lantern flames flickered weakly against black walls coated with coal dust. Children worked in silence much of the time because breathing itself required effort in the thick air. Some spent entire shifts opening ventilation doors in darkness broken only by dim light. Others hauled coal carts through cramped tunnels where the ceiling pressed low overhead. Their bodies hardened early from the strain. Muscles developed before childhood fully ended. Hands became rough and scarred. Coughs deepened. And always there remained the danger of collapse, explosion, or accident hidden within the darkness surrounding them. Yet even underground, children sometimes found brief moments of humanity. Workers told quiet stories during meal breaks. Someone hummed an old song. An older miner shared bread with a younger child too hungry to concentrate. The human spirit adjusted itself even to places never meant for children. Above ground, meanwhile, another kind of childhood slowly expanded among wealthy families. Large homes grew quieter and more carefully organized during the 19th century. Separate nurseries appeared where children spent much of their time away from adults. Toys became more common. Books written specifically for children filled shelves beside polished furniture. Middle-class families increasingly believed childhood should be protected and guided carefully. Education became important not simply for survival, but for shaping character itself. Children practiced piano scales in peaceful sitting rooms while rain tapped softly against tall windows. They studied geography beside fireplaces warming entire rooms through long winter afternoons. Nannies tucked them into soft beds beneath clean blankets while servants extinguished candles one by one down silent hallways. For these children, labor remained mostly invisible. Meals appeared prepared. Floors remained clean. Laundry returned folded neatly. Coal arrived beside fireplaces as if by magic. But hidden beneath that comfort were countless workers, many still very young themselves. A servant girl might rise before dawn to light fires throughout the house while the family still slept upstairs. She scrubbed floors, emptied chamber pots, washed clothing, polished silver, and carried endless buckets of water through narrow servant staircases rarely seen by guests. Sometimes she was only 13 or 14 years old. Sometimes younger. Her childhood faded quietly behind the smooth appearance of someone else's comfort. And so the century held many different childhoods all at once. Some surrounded by books and gardens. Others shaped entirely by labor and survival. Yet even wealthy children faced strict expectations. Their lives were often carefully controlled by schedules, manners, lessons, religion, and social rules. Boys prepared for business, law, military service, or politics. Girls prepared for marriage, household management, and polite society. Freedom itself remained limited in different ways depending upon class and circumstance. Still, there was undeniable softness in some lives and relentless hardship in others. As years passed, reform movements slowly gained strength. Doctors published reports describing children weakened by factory labor. Religious groups opened charity schools in poor neighborhoods. Journalists visited mines and mills, writing about dangerous conditions hidden behind factory walls. Photographs from the late 19th century began showing tired young workers standing beside enormous machines. Thin faces. Serious eyes. Small bodies already carrying adult exhaustion. People looking at those photographs could no longer easily pretend childhood remained untouched by industrial life. Laws slowly began changing in some places. Certain factories reduced working hours for children. Some governments required limited school attendance. Dangerous labor for very young children became restricted in a few industries. But change rarely happened evenly. One town enforced protections while another ignored them. Some employers found ways around regulations. Poor families still depended desperately upon wages earned by children. And so many young workers continued rising before dawn year after year. The industrial world had been built partly upon their labor, though history often remembered the machines more clearly than the children standing beside them. At night, after shifts finally ended, exhausted workers spilled back into the streets beneath fading daylight. The city looked different then. Windows glowed warmly above narrow alleys. Supper smells drifted through the air from crowded apartments where families prepared simple evening meals. Tavern doors opened onto noisy rooms filled with tired laborers trying briefly to escape the weight of the day. Children walked home slowly. Some carried younger siblings asleep against their shoulders. Others stopped beside bakery windows staring at pastries too expensive to buy. Many simply hurried home through rain or cold, thinking about rest. Inside small apartments, evenings followed familiar routines. Wet boots left beside doors. Soup ladled into bowls. Clothing mended beneath candlelight. Parents discussing work in low tired voices. Children falling asleep before finishing meals. Sometimes families shared small moments of comfort together despite everything surrounding them. A father telling stories from his own childhood beside the fire. A mother brushing tangled hair gently before bed. Brothers and sisters whispering quietly beneath blankets while wind rattled the windows outside. These moments mattered because they reminded people they were more than workers. more than tired bodies moving between factory and home. Even in the hardest places, human beings searched for warmth and connection. And children, no matter how exhausted, still carried traces of imagination within them. A shadow on the wall became a giant. Rain on the roof sounded like distant rivers. Smoke drifting past moonlight looked almost beautiful for a moment. The city itself softened late at night. Factory noise faded into the distance. Fog gathered again along quiet streets. Horses slept inside dark stables while river water moved slowly beneath bridges reflecting scattered lantern light. And somewhere beyond all the smoke and labor, beyond the crowded cities and endless machinery, ancient rivers still flowed through warm night air beneath silent stars. The world kept turning slowly through every century. Children kept growing older. And history moved quietly forward one exhausted morning at a time. Sometimes the rain lasted for days. Gray clouds hung low above the city while water slid endlessly down brick walls blackened by soot. Gutters overflowed into muddy streets where wagon wheels carved deep tracks through wet earth and ash. Damp air settled into everything. Clothing never fully dried. Blankets smelled faintly of smoke and moisture. Even inside crowded homes, the cold seemed to creep slowly through floors and walls during long stretches of rain. For working families, bad weather rarely changed the routine. Factories still opened before sunrise. Markets still filled with noise. Ships still arrived at the docks. And children still walked through the rain toward another day of labor. Before dawn, the streets looked almost empty except for workers moving quietly beneath umbrellas, shawls, or old coats darkened by water. Some children wrapped scraps of cloth around their shoes to keep their feet warm. Others simply accepted the cold wetness soaking through their clothing before the workday had even begun. The gas lamps reflected softly across puddles. Smoke drifted low between buildings. Far away, factory whistles echoed through the rain. Inside textile mills, the damp weather often made the air even heavier. Steam mixed with floating fibers until the rooms felt thick and difficult to breathe. Windows fogged almost completely, shutting out the outside world behind pale gray glass. Children bent over machines while droplets of moisture gathered along metal surfaces. The floors became slippery beneath worn shoes. Threads snapped constantly in the humid air, forcing workers to move faster and faster to keep the machines running smoothly. Some children developed deep coughs that never fully disappeared. Others complained quietly of chest pain or headaches after long hours breathing dust and steam. But complaints rarely changed much. Most supervisors cared more about production than comfort. And poor families could not afford for children to stop working simply because they felt tired or unwell. So the days continued. Hour after hour. Bell after bell. Morning fading into afternoon beneath artificial light. Sometimes children measured time not by clocks, but by physical feelings. The ache in their backs. The heaviness in their eyelids. The hunger growing slowly in their stomachs before meal breaks arrived. In crowded workshops across the city, other children performed different kinds of labor beneath the same endless rain. Young girls stitched clothing in long dim rooms where rows of workers sat shoulder to shoulder beside narrow tables. Needles moved constantly through fabric while candle flames flickered against tired faces. The work demanded patience and concentration. Eyes strained in poor light. Fingers bled from repeated pricks. Necks stiffened from leaning forward hour after hour. Some sewing rooms remained quiet except for the sound of scissors cutting cloth and rain tapping softly against windows. Others filled with coughing, whispered conversation, crying babies brought by desperate mothers, and the creaking of floorboards beneath endless movement. Clothing made their traveled far beyond the neighborhoods where it was sewn. Fine dresses for wealthy women. Uniforms. Shirts. Coats. Children stitched garments they themselves would never wear. At the docks, rain transformed the harbor into a world of fog and slippery wood. Ships emerged slowly through the mist like dark floating shadows. Sailors shouted through cold air while ropes groaned under heavy strain. Water slapped softly against stone walls lined with moss and coal dust. Children hauling cargo there often worked with numb fingers and soaked clothing. Barrels rolled across wet planks. Crates shifted dangerously during unloading. The smell of salt water mixed with fish, smoke, and river mud. Some boys slept inside warehouses during storms because walking home through flooded streets after midnight felt impossible. They curled beside sacks of grain or coils of rope while rain hammered against wooden roofs overhead. Morning arrived too quickly there as well. It always did. In the countryside, rain carried different meanings. Farmers watched dark clouds carefully because entire harvests depended upon weather arriving at the right moment. Too little rain brought dry fields and weak crops. Too much rain flooded roads and ruined planting schedules. Children working on farms experienced weather directly every day. They felt cold mud pulling at their boots while carrying feed across barnyards. They smelled wet hay stacked inside wooden sheds where animals huddled together during storms. They listened to rain striking rooftops while mending tools beside lantern light late into the evening. Farm work rarely paused completely. Cows still needed milking. Animals still needed feeding. Water still needed carrying. Even during harsh winters, children crossed icy yards before sunrise carrying buckets while snow blew sideways through the darkness. Their hands cracked from cold. Their shoulders hardened from lifting. And slowly, without anyone fully noticing, childhood continued slipping quietly into responsibility. Many parents probably remembered their own childhoods only dimly by then. Life moved too quickly for reflection. There was always more work waiting tomorrow. More bills. More repairs. More mouths to feed. Still, love existed deeply inside these families despite exhaustion surrounding daily life. A mother waking early to warm soup before her children left for work. A father repairing worn shoes late at night by candlelight. Older siblings carrying younger children asleep from one room to another without waking them. These acts of care happened quietly and constantly. The 19th century could be harsh, but it was also full of ordinary tenderness hidden beneath hardship. Sometimes children themselves protected one another better than adults could. Older girls in factories watched carefully over younger workers during dangerous tasks. Boys walking home late at night stayed together through rough neighborhoods where drunken men wandered dark streets near taverns and docks. Friendships formed in difficult places. Children shared bread during breaks. Whispered stories while working. Laughed softly at small things simply because laughter relieved the heaviness for a moment. Even in exhausting conditions, young people still searched for traces of joy. A snowball thrown quickly before work. Sliding across frozen puddles. Watching stray dogs chase one another through market streets. Listening to street musicians playing fiddles beneath glowing lamps in the evening fog. These moments passed quickly, but they mattered. Because childhood rarely disappears all at once. It survives in fragments. In small acts of imagination. In brief moments of play hidden between responsibilities. In tired children still looking up at snowfall or moonlight despite everything weighing upon them. As industrial cities expanded, the distance between rich and poor became increasingly visible. In wealthy districts, large windows glowed warmly behind clean curtains while servants prepared evening meals inside polished kitchens. Horse carriages rolled quietly down broad streets lined with trees and stone houses. Children there often spent afternoons indoors beside books, music lessons, embroidery, or tutors teaching history and language. Their clothing remained clean. Their hands soft. Their schedules carefully planned. Meanwhile, only a few streets away, working children returned home through mud carrying tools or bundles of laundry after 12 hours of labor. The contrast shaped the century deeply. Some wealthy reformers genuinely felt disturbed by the suffering surrounding them. They visited poor districts and described overcrowded housing, dangerous factories, and exhausted children in letters, newspapers, and speeches. Others preferred not to look closely at all. Industrial progress brought enormous wealth to many families. Factories produced goods faster than ever before. Railroads connected distant cities. Trade expanded across oceans. The world appeared to be moving forward rapidly. Yet much of that progress depended upon labor invisible to those benefiting from it most. Especially the labor of children. In mining villages, the signs of hardship appeared everywhere. Coal dust settled over laundry hanging outdoors. Black smoke drifted constantly from chimneys. The ground itself seemed stained dark beneath rows of narrow workers' houses crowded close together near the pits. Children there often looked older than they truly were. Long hours underground changed posture, breathing, even facial expressions. Many boys developed persistent coughs before adulthood. Some suffered injuries that never fully healed. Yet mining communities also carried strong bonds between families. People depended upon one another. Neighbors shared food during difficult winters. Women cared for sick children together while men worked underground. Entire villages mourned accidents collectively when disasters struck the mines. At night, after exhausting shifts, workers gathered quietly beside fires while cold winds swept outside through narrow streets. Children listened sleepily to adult conversations about wages, injuries, weather, strikes, and rumors of change coming someday. Sometimes someone sang softly. Sometimes silence felt easier. Beyond the industrial towns, trains crossed the countryside carrying coal, steel, fabric, and workers between growing cities. Railroads became symbols of modern life during the 19th century. Iron tracks stretched farther each year across forests, fields, mountains, and rivers. Children worked there too. Some sold newspapers at stations filled with steam and noise. Others cleaned train cars or loaded cargo beside the tracks. Young boys carried luggage for travelers hurrying beneath enormous station roofs echoing with footsteps and whistles. The stations themselves felt alive at all hours. Steam drifted upward into glass ceilings. Porters shouted directions. Passengers embraced goodbye beneath flickering lamps. Rain rattled against metal roofs while trains disappeared into the darkness beyond the city. For many working children, trains represented distant worlds they would never fully see. Places beyond factories. Beyond mines. Beyond crowded streets. Places imagined only briefly before another shift began. At home, evenings remain the softest part of the day for many families despite their exhaustion. After supper, small rooms grew quieter. Children sat beside fires mending clothing or simply resting tired bodies. Mothers folded laundry while fathers removed heavy work boots stiff with mud or coal dust. Sometimes candlelight flickered gently across walls while wind moved outside through narrow alleys. The body slowly relaxed then. Shoulders loosened. Voices softened. The long day finally released its grip little by little. Children often fell asleep listening to ordinary household sounds. The scrape of spoons against bowls. Low adult conversation. Rain on rooftops. a baby breathing nearby. The crackling of weak fires nearly burned out for the night. These quiet domestic moments rarely appear in history books, yet they shaped life more deeply than many famous events. Because most people did not spend their days thinking about politics or empire or industry. They thought about warmth, food, rest, children, tomorrow's work. And somewhere deep inside themselves, many parents likely hoped their children might someday live differently than they had. Perhaps with less labor, more schooling, more time, more softness in their lives. Those hopes moved quietly through the 19th century like candlelight inside dark rooms. Slowly, faintly, but steadily. And outside the crowded cities, beyond the smoke and noise, rivers still moved through the night beneath ancient stars while wind crossed empty fields where tired workers slept until morning returned once more. Winter mornings often arrived without color. The sky turned pale slowly above the city, but sunlight struggled to reach the narrow streets between tall brick buildings. Smoke from countless chimneys drifted low through the cold air, covering rooftops in a gray haze that softened the edges of everything. The world felt quiet for a few moments before work began. Snow rested along windowsills and gathered beside doorways where yesterday's footprints had already frozen hard during the night. Horses stood patiently beside wagons with steam rising from their bodies into the icy morning air. Somewhere far away, church bells rang softly through the fog. Inside crowded apartments, families woke reluctantly beneath thin blankets. Cold touched every surface. Children pulled stiff clothing over tired bodies while trying not to leave the warmth of shared beds too quickly. Mothers stirred weak fires back to life using scraps of coal saved carefully from the day before. Fathers rubbed aching hands before lacing worn boots darkened by years of labor. Breakfast, if there was one, remained simple. Bread hardened from the cold. Thin porridge. Tea with little sugar. Then came the familiar sounds from outside. Factory whistles. Wagon wheels. Footsteps gathering in the street. Another workday had begun. Children stepped into the freezing darkness beside adults whose faces already carried the exhaustion of many winters just like this one. Breath floated white around them while snow crunched softly beneath worn shoes. Some children walked long distances to factories before sunrise. They crossed bridges coated with ice where black river water moved silently below. They hurried through alleys smelling of smoke and damp wood. They passed bakery windows glowing warmly in the darkness where workers inside had already been awake for hours kneading dough beside hot ovens. The smell of fresh bread drifting into the cold street could feel almost painful to hungry children. Inside the factories, winter disappeared quickly. The buildings felt overheated from machinery, steam, and crowded bodies working close together. Windows fogged immediately. Damp coats hung dripping beside entrances while workers hurried to their stations before supervisors noticed any delay. Children moved between machines with practiced speed. By now, many no longer remembered life before labor. Factory rhythms shaped their understanding of time itself. The morning bell. The meal break. The evening whistle. The endless turning of gears between them. Young workers learned to judge the moods of supervisors by footsteps alone. They learned how to keep their hands moving even while half asleep. They learned how to ignore hunger, headaches, sore muscles, and coughing fits long enough to finish another shift. The body adapts quietly to difficult routines. That adaptation frightened some reformers who visited industrial cities during the 19th century. They expected outrage or rebellion from exhausted children, but often found something calmer and sadder instead. Acceptance. Not because the work was easy, but because it had become normal. A child born into industrial poverty rarely expected comfort. Long hours, crowded housing, cold winters, and dangerous labor simply formed the shape of ordinary life. And still, children remained children in certain quiet ways. During short breaks, they sometimes traced shapes into coal dust with their fingers. They whispered stories about ghosts, animals, faraway places, or strange dreams remembered from the night before. Some collected small treasures found in the street: smooth stones, bits of ribbon, old coins, broken watches, bird feathers carried into the city by the wind. Tiny reminders that imagination survived beneath exhaustion. In sewing workshops, winter light barely reached the crowded tables where girls bent over endless piles of fabric. Candles and oil lamps burned throughout much of the day, their flames trembling whenever cold drafts slipped through cracks in windows or doors. The room smelled of cloth, wax, damp wool, and tired bodies. Needles flashed steadily through pale fingers roughened by work. Scissors scraped across tables. Thread tangled constantly. Some girls stitched until their shoulders ached so deeply they could hardly lift their arms afterward. Others struggled to keep their eyes open during evening hours when the candlelight blurred into soft yellow haze around them. Yet conversations still drifted quietly through the rooms. Whispers about families. About illness. About someone getting married. About rumors of better wages elsewhere. Sometimes laughter appeared suddenly and briefly before fading again beneath fatigue. Human warmth continued surviving even in difficult places. Outside, snow fell softly across the city. Street sweepers pushed slush away from market roads before dawn. Dock workers hauled frozen ropes stiff with ice beside dark river water. Newsboys shouted headlines through the cold while their fingers turned red from carrying damp papers all morning. Children working outdoors during winter endured especially hard days. Some sold matches or flowers on street corners while snow gathered along their shoulders. Others cleaned horse stables where the smell of hay and animals mixed with cold air drifting through cracked wooden walls. A few children slept in workshops or storage buildings because their homes lay too far away to walk safely after late shifts ended. Cities at night could feel dangerous for young workers. Fog thickened after sunset. Gas lamps glowed weakly through drifting snow or rain. Drunken voices echoed from taverns near docks and factory districts. Children hurried home in groups whenever possible, pulling coats tightly around themselves against both weather and fear. Back inside crowded apartments, winter evenings settled heavily over working-class neighborhoods. Families gathered close to whatever heat they could afford. Small fires burned low to save coal. Soup simmered slowly in iron pots. Wet socks and gloves dried beside stoves while steam fogged the windows. The rooms looked softer then. Candlelight warmed tired faces. Children rested against parents or siblings after long shifts. Some fell asleep sitting upright before supper ended. Others listened quietly while adults discussed work accidents, rising food prices, illnesses spreading nearby, or rumors about labor strikes beginning in another part of the city. Sometimes someone read aloud from a newspaper if they could read well enough. Sometimes stories replaced newspapers entirely. Old family memories. Religious tales. Village legends carried into the city years earlier by grandparents who once lived far from factories and smoke. Children listened with heavy eyes while the wind rattled outside. And for a little while, the room felt safer than the world beyond the walls. In rural areas, winter carried a different kind of silence. Snow-covered fields where crops once grew beneath summer heat. Trees stood dark against pale skies while frozen rivers moved slowly under thin sheets of ice. Farm children still worked every day despite the cold. Animals needed feeding before sunrise. Wood needed chopping. Water buckets froze if left outside too long. The work often felt slower during winter, but never truly stopped. Inside barns, lantern light glowed softly against wooden beams while cows breathed warm air into the freezing darkness. Children carried hay across floors scattered with straw. Boots squeaked through packed snow outside. At night, rural homes sometimes felt deeply peaceful after the labor ended. Wind moved gently around the house while fires crackled low beside heavy wooden tables. The smell of soup, bread, smoke, and damp wool filled the rooms. Children there often slept more deeply than city workers because darkness itself lasted longer in the countryside. No factory whistles echoed before dawn. No endless machinery shook the walls. Only winter wind and distant animal sounds beneath the stars. Yet even rural childhood remained filled with responsibility. A farm depended upon every pair of hands. By adolescence, many boys already worked beside fathers as equals during difficult seasons. Girls managed cooking, laundry, sewing, childcare, and household labor with adult skill long before reaching adulthood themselves. The idea of childhood as a long protected stage of life remained impossible for many families regardless of where they lived. Still, change slowly continued moving through society. Schools expanded in certain cities. Some factories shortened working hours for younger children. Charity organizations opened shelters and classrooms for poor families struggling most severely. Photographers captured images of child laborers that spread through newspapers and books. Readers saw thin, exhausted children standing beside giant machines or staring solemnly into the camera with faces far older than their years. These images unsettled many people. Because once seen clearly, it became harder to ignore how much childhood had already disappeared beneath industrial life. And yet the change remained uneven. For every child entering school, another still entered a factory. For every law passed limiting labor, another family desperately needed wages their children earned. History rarely moves neatly. It shifts slowly through ordinary lives filled with compromise, survival, hope, and exhaustion all tangled together. In mining regions, winter could feel especially harsh. Cold winds swept across blackened villages where rows of small houses stood beneath towering heaps of coal waste. The snow itself turned gray after settling near the mines. Children descended underground before sunrise carrying lamps that flickered weakly against the darkness. Down there, seasons barely existed. The tunnels remained damp and closed all year long. Water dripped steadily from ceilings into mud beneath worn boots. Coal dust coated skin until it seemed impossible to fully wash away. Many miners later remembered the strange silence of snowfall after emerging from long shifts underground. The world above felt muted, soft, almost unreal after hours spent beneath the earth surrounded by scraping wheels and echoing tools. Children noticed that silence too. Perhaps they appreciated it more deeply because their lives held so little quiet elsewhere. Late at night, after families finally slept, the industrial cities settled into an uneasy calm. Factory smoke still drifted beneath moonlight. Rivers moved black and silent beside frozen docks. Street lamps flickered through fog while stray dogs wandered empty alleys searching for warmth. Inside tiny apartments, exhausted children dreamed beside the sounds of coughing adults, creaking floorboards, distant train whistles, and winter wind pressing softly against the windows. Some dreamed of fields. Some dreamed of rivers. Some dreamed of nothing at all because exhaustion had followed them even into sleep. And somewhere beyond all the factories and crowded streets, beyond the railroads and mines and endless labor, the stars remained bright above quiet ancient landscapes where river water still moved gently through reeds beneath the cold clear night. Spring arrived slowly in the industrial cities. At first, almost nothing seemed to change. The smoke still drifted over rooftops. Factory whistles still sounded before dawn. Children still walked through cold streets carrying lunch wrapped in cloth beneath tired arms. But little by little, winter loosened its grip. Snow melted into dark streams running beside cobblestone roads. Bare trees along the edges of the city showed the first small signs of green. Rain became softer and warmer. The air carried the faint smell of wet earth beneath the heavier odors of coal smoke and machinery. For working children, spring did not mean rest. Yet the season changed the feeling of the streets. Markets grew louder again. Doors remained open longer during the afternoons. Sunlight reached farther into narrow alleys where children paused briefly during errands to feel warmth against their faces after months of cold wind. Along the riverfront, fog lifted earlier in the mornings. Dock workers unloaded ships beneath pale golden skies while seagulls circled overhead crying sharply through the damp air. Water slapped gently against wooden piers darkened by years of rain and tar. Children working there noticed the return of light before almost anyone else. They began their days so early that sunrise unfolded around them constantly. They watched darkness fade across the river while steam rose from boats drifting silently through the morning mist. For a few quiet moments, before the shouting and lifting and endless movement began, the harbor could feel strangely peaceful. Then the workday swallowed the calm again. Crates crashed against the docks. Ropes tightened. Men shouted orders. Children hurried between warehouses carrying tools, messages, and bundles almost too heavy for their small arms. In textile mills, spring air drifted faintly through cracked windows that supervisors sometimes opened for short periods during warmer afternoons. Workers breathed more easily then, though the dust and heat still filled the rooms thickly. The factories remained exhausting places no matter the season. Machines never slowed for sunshine. The rhythm continued exactly as before. Children stood beside spinning frames hour after hour while sunlight moved slowly across the dirty windows high above them. Their hands worked automatically now, shaped completely by repetition. Some children had already spent nearly their entire lives inside factories. A girl beginning work at 7 years old might reach 14 hardly remembering mornings without bells or long days without machinery surrounding her. Childhood faded so gradually that many young workers barely realized what had been lost. Responsibility simply arrived earlier each year. A boy once trusted only to sweep floors now operated dangerous machines himself. A girl once carrying thread between tables now supervised younger children newly entering the workshop. The cycle repeated quietly. Older children teaching younger ones how to survive the labor waiting ahead. How to avoid injuries. How to move quickly enough. How to endure long hours without drawing punishment. And beneath those practical lessons, another quieter understanding passed between them. Do not expect too much softness from life. In poorer neighborhoods, spring also revealed the damage winter had left behind. Walls stained by dampness. Roofs leaking after heavy rains. Children weakened by months of poor nutrition and cold crowded housing. Doctors visiting working-class districts often described pale faces, swollen joints, persistent coughs, and exhaustion lingering even in very young children. Disease spread easily once warmer weather returned. Open drains beside narrow streets carried foul water through crowded areas where families lived packed closely together. Flies gathered around market waste. Clean drinking water remained difficult to find in some districts. Mothers worried constantly about illness. A fever could change everything for a poor family. If a child stopped working, wages disappeared immediately. If parents became sick as well, rent and food quickly became impossible to afford. And so many people continued laboring while unwell simply because survival demanded it. Children walked to factories coughing into cloths. Women sewed through headaches and fevers. Men worked construction sites with injured backs and swollen hands. The body became something to push forward rather than care for. Yet human tenderness still appeared everywhere beneath the hardship. A neighbor bringing soup to a sick child. An older sister staying awake through the night beside a younger brother struggling to breathe. Workers collecting small coins together after someone suffered an injury. These acts rarely entered official histories, but they formed the hidden structure holding communities together. Especially among the poor. In wealthier homes, spring arrived more gently. Windows opened to fresh air carrying the smell of gardens beginning to bloom. Curtains moved softly in warm breezes. Children studied beside sunlight instead of candlelight during the longer afternoons. Some families traveled to the countryside once the weather improved. Carriages rolled beyond the smoke-filled city toward quieter landscapes where green fields stretched beneath open skies. For wealthy children, spring often meant freedom returning after long winter months indoors. Walking through gardens. Reading beneath trees. Playing games on clean lawns untouched by factory ash. But even there, servants prepared every comfortable detail quietly in the background. Young maids scrubbed floors before sunrise. Kitchen boys carried coal and water endlessly through servant hallways. Stable children cared for horses standing patiently beside polished carriages. Their labor remained mostly invisible. The 19th century depended heavily upon invisible work. Especially the work done by children. In rural villages, spring brought enormous activity after the stillness of winter. Fields softened beneath rain and sunlight. Farmers repaired fences damaged by snow and wind. Seeds needed planting quickly once the ground became ready. Children rose before dawn to help prepare the land. Boots sank into wet soil while birds called from hedges lining narrow country roads. The smell of fresh earth filled the cool morning air. Horses pulled plows slowly across fields shining with moisture beneath pale skies. The work lasted from sunrise until evening during busy planting weeks. Hands blistered from tools. Backs ached from bending over rows of crops. Mud clung heavily to clothing and boots. Yet many people preferred this labor to factory work because at least it happened beneath open skies. Children working in fields could still hear birdsong. Still feel wind. Still watch clouds moving overhead. Nature remained present beside the hardship. And at night, rural silence returned more completely than in industrial cities. After supper, families sometimes sat quietly outside their homes while the last light faded over distant hills. Frogs called from nearby streams. Smoke drifted gently upward from chimneys into the cool evening air. Children grew sleepy listening to insects and wind instead of machinery. Still tired. Still overworked. But surrounded by a different kind of world. As the century moved forward, more people began questioning whether childhood should belong so completely to labor. Teachers argued that education could change society itself. Reformers described children not simply as workers, but as future citizens needing care and protection. The language people used slowly shifted. Writers began speaking about innocence, development, growing minds, the emotional needs of children. These ideas spread unevenly across different classes and countries, but they slowly reshaped expectations. Middle-class families increasingly kept children away from adult labor altogether whenever possible. Toys became more common. Special clothing for children appeared in stores. Schools expanded. Books written specifically for young readers filled shelves beside family Bibles and household manuals. But for the poor, ideas alone changed very little at first. A father unemployed after injury still needed money. A widow still needed rent paid. A family with 6 children still needed food. And so millions of working children continued waking before dawn despite growing public concern surrounding child labor. Some industries adjusted slightly. Factories reduced hours for very young workers in certain places. Mines introduced limited restrictions. School attendance laws appeared gradually. Yet enforcement remained weak. Inspectors could not visit everywhere. Employers found loopholes. Families themselves sometimes lied about children's ages because they needed the wages desperately. History changed slowly because poverty itself changed slowly. At night, children often returned home too exhausted even to speak much. The streets softened beneath evening light while workers drifted steadily back toward crowded neighborhoods. Bakery windows glowed warmly. Laundry fluttered from upper windows above narrow alleys. Music sometimes drifted faintly from taverns where tired adults gathered after long shifts. Children walked quietly through all of it. Some carried tools. Some carried younger siblings. Some carried nothing at all because exhaustion already felt heavy enough. Inside homes, supper remained simple. Bread. Potatoes. Soup. Perhaps fish or meat when money allowed. Families ate close together beneath weak candlelight while shadows flickered gently against the walls. Afterward came the small nightly rituals holding life together. Boots drying near the fire. Work clothes folded carefully for morning. Hair brushed. Cuts cleaned. Children tucked beneath blankets. Parents speaking quietly after the younger ones finally slept. These moments often contain the deepest expressions of love. Not grand speeches. Not dramatic gestures. Just tired people caring for one another as gently as they could after difficult days. A mother adjusting blankets around sleeping children before extinguishing the candle. A father carrying water upstairs because his daughter looked too exhausted to lift another bucket. Hands resting softly on tired shoulders. The industrial world could be cold and mechanical, but ordinary human tenderness continued surviving within it stubbornly. And children remembered tenderness very clearly. Sometimes more clearly than hardship itself. A warm kitchen during rain. The smell of bread baking. A lullaby heard half asleep. Sunlight falling across a wooden floor on a rare free afternoon. These memories stayed alive quietly inside people long after childhood ended. Outside, the city darkened slowly beneath the smoke-filled evening sky. Factory windows glowed beside black rivers moving silently past crowded docks. Trains rumbled through distant stations carrying goods and workers across the growing industrial world. And above it all, the first stars appeared faintly through the haze while exhausted children drifted into uneasy sleep, waiting for another dawn already approaching beyond the rooftops. Summer brought heat into every corner of the city. By midday, the narrow streets seemed to hold the warmth inside them. Brick walls baked beneath the sun. Smoke from factory chimneys hung heavily in the still air, refusing to drift away. Horses moved more slowly pulling wagons through crowded roads shimmering with dust and heat. For working children, summer often felt even more exhausting than winter. The factories became unbearable during long afternoons. Inside textile mills, steam and machinery turned the air thick and suffocating. Windows stood open when possible, but little breeze reached the crowded rooms where hundreds of workers labored shoulder to shoulder beneath rattling belts and spinning wheels. Sweat soaked through clothing almost immediately. Dust clung to damp skin. Children wiped their foreheads with rough sleeves while trying not to lose concentration around dangerous machines. The sound inside those buildings never softened. Metal clattered endlessly. Belts snapped against wheels overhead. Supervisors shouted instructions through the roar of machinery. And beneath it all came the quieter sounds of exhaustion. Coughing. Heavy breathing. Footsteps dragging slowly by late afternoon. Sometimes younger children became dizzy from the heat and poor air. A few fainted beside the machines after long hours standing without enough food or water. Older workers usually helped them quietly if supervisors allowed it. A cup of water. A damp cloth against the face. A whispered instruction to breathe slowly. Then, most often, the work continued. Factories rarely stopped for human weakness. Outside, the city smelled different during summer. Warm river water carried odors from docks crowded with fish, coal, mud, and rotting wood. Market streets filled with the scent of vegetables left too long in the heat. Open drains beside overcrowded neighborhoods spread foul air through narrow alleys where sunlight barely reached the ground. Flies gathered everywhere. Children swatted them away while carrying bread, sweeping workshops, or selling goods beside crowded roads. Illness spread quickly during hot months. Doctors worried about contaminated water and disease moving through poor districts where entire families shared tiny rooms with little fresh air. Children weakened by years of labor often became sick first. Still, work rarely paused. A fever might keep someone home for a day or two if the illness became severe enough. But many children returned too early because their families depended upon every small wage earned. And so the city continued breathing through heat and exhaustion together. At the docks, summer mornings began before sunrise whenever possible. Workers tried to unload ships during the cooler hours before the full heat settled over the harbor. Children hurried along wooden piers carrying ropes, tools, messages, and crates while gulls screamed overhead against pale skies slowly brightening over the river. The water reflected gold and silver at dawn. For a few moments, before the noise truly began, the harbor looked almost beautiful. Masts swayed gently. Fog drifted low across the river. Oars moved quietly through the stillness. Then came the shouting. The lifting. The endless labor beneath the rising sun. By noon, shirts clung heavily to sweaty backs. Dock workers wiped grime from their faces while standing beside ships loaded with timber, cotton, grain, machinery, and coal. Children working there learned quickly how to move through crowded, dangerous spaces without getting hurt. They stepped around swinging cargo. Avoided rolling barrels. Stayed clear of thick ropes tightening suddenly under strain. One careless moment could lead to serious injury. Yet many children moved through the chaos almost gracefully from long practice. The body adapts. Even to difficult worlds. In wealthier neighborhoods, summer unfolded very differently. Windows stood open beneath white curtains moving softly in warm breezes. Gardens bloomed behind iron fences where roses climbed carefully trimmed walls. Children played beneath trees while nurses watched nearby from shaded benches. Some wealthy families left the cities entirely during the hottest months. Trains carried them toward quieter countryside villages or seaside towns where cooler air drifted across open landscapes untouched by factory smoke. There, children walked along beaches collecting shells or reading books beneath the shade of wide trees. Their summers contained long afternoons, clean clothing, fresh air, and gentle routines shaped more by comfort than survival. But hidden behind that peacefulness remained the labor of others. Servants packed trunks. Stable boys prepared horses. Kitchen maids worked beside hot stoves through the summer heat while wealthy families rested elsewhere. The century divided childhood sharply along lines of class. For some children, summer meant freedom. For others, simply more work beneath hotter skies. In rural farming communities, summer became the busiest season of all. The countryside glowed beneath endless sunlight. Wheat fields moved softly in warm wind like waves across golden water. Insects hummed through tall grass. Dust rose slowly behind wagons traveling narrow roads between villages and farms. Children woke before dawn because the workdays stretched so long during summer. Animals needed feeding early before the heat became too strong. Fields required constant attention. Crops grew quickly beneath the sun, and every task carried urgency. Boys guided horses through fields while sweat darkened their shirts by morning. Girls carried water, cooked meals for workers, gathered vegetables, washed clothing, and helped with harvest preparations. The labor could feel endless. Yet summer evenings in the countryside often carried deep quietness once the work finally ended. Families sat outside after supper while the remaining heat slowly faded from the earth. Fireflies drifted through darkening fields. Crickets sang beside fences and streams. The sky stretched wide above them, filled with soft colors fading into night. Children sometimes fell asleep outdoors before parents carried them gently inside. Even exhausted children still noticed beauty when it appeared softly enough. A cool breeze after a hot day. The smell of fresh cut hay. Moonlight across fields. Water moving quietly through irrigation ditches beneath the stars. These moments offered small kinds of relief. And relief mattered greatly in lives filled with labor. Back in the industrial cities, nights remained restless during summer. The heat lingered inside crowded apartments long after sunset. Windows stayed open, allowing sounds from the streets to drift through the darkness. Arguments. Laughter. Crying babies. Distant music from taverns. Wagon wheels rattling across stone roads even after midnight. Families slept lightly in the heavy air. Children tossed beneath thin blankets while sweat gathered along their necks and foreheads. Some slept on rooftops or near open windows, hoping for cooler breezes drifting from the river. Morning always arrived too quickly. Before sunrise, mothers already moved quietly through the rooms preparing for another day. Bread sliced carefully. Water poured into tin cups. Work clothes shaken free of dust from the previous shift. Children woke slowly, bodies still tired from yesterday before today had even begun. The repetition shaped them deeply. One day blending into another beneath seasons that changed while labor remained constant. And yet, throughout the 19th century, small changes continued appearing almost unnoticed at first. More schools opened. Some factories began refusing very young workers. Religious charities created shelters and evening classes for poor children unable to attend school during the day. A few working-class families slowly gained enough stability to keep younger children at home longer before sending them into labor. These changes happened unevenly and slowly, but they mattered. Because the idea of childhood itself was gradually shifting. People increasingly imagined children as needing protection, education, and time to grow. Not only labor. Not only usefulness. The transformation remained incomplete, especially for poor families, but the conversation had begun. Writers described exhausted child workers in novels and newspapers. Painters showed thin young faces beside dark factory interiors. Reformers visited mines, mills, and crowded housing districts documenting the conditions surrounding industrial childhood. Some factory owners resisted criticism completely. Others insisted labor built discipline and character. Many poor parents themselves held complicated feelings. Work was harsh, yes. But without those wages, families might starve. There were rarely simple answers inside poverty. only difficult choices repeated day after day. And children understood more than adults sometimes realized. They noticed worry in their parents' voices when rent became due. They saw mothers quietly skipping meals so younger children could eat more. They watched fathers return home injured or exhausted after dangerous work. Many children accepted labor early because they felt responsible for family survival. That sense of duty could become very strong. A young girl helping support younger siblings through sewing wages might feel pride mixed together with exhaustion. A boy working long hours at the docks might stand taller knowing his earnings helped buy coal during winter. Childhood faded partly because necessity demanded it, but also because many children themselves stepped willingly into adult responsibilities out of love for their families. At night, after the worst heat faded, the city softened again. Warm wind moved slowly between buildings while gas lamps glowed beside dark streets. River water reflected scattered lights from factories still operating late into the evening. Children walked home through the heavy summer air carrying fatigue like another weight upon their shoulders. Some stopped briefly beside public fountains to splash cool water against dusty faces. Others lingered near bakery windows breathing in the comforting smell of fresh bread drifting into the night. Inside homes, families gathered around open windows seeking any movement of air. Shirt sleeves rolled upward. Candles flickered softly. Someone fanned a sleeping baby gently with folded paper. Conversations drifted quietly through the darkness while distant factory sounds continued somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Even during hard years, evenings still held traces of peace. A mother humming softly while mending clothes. Brothers whispering stories before sleep. The sound of summer rain finally arriving after days of heat. Human life continued creating small islands of comfort against enormous hardship. And perhaps that is why people endured so much. Not because suffering became easy, but because tenderness survived beside it. Outside, beyond the crowded industrial world, ancient rivers still moved quietly through warm night air beneath endless stars. Water touched reeds softly along silent shores. Wind crossed sleeping fields. And somewhere, far from smoke and machinery, darkness rested gently over the earth while tired children everywhere drifted slowly into sleep. Autumn arrived almost quietly. At first, only small things changed. The mornings became cooler. A sharper wind moved through the streets before sunrise. Leaves gathered along gutters beside the roads where rainwater carried bits of coal dust toward the river. Children noticed the season while walking to work in the darkness. Summer's warmth faded from the stones beneath their feet. Breath slowly became visible again in the early air. The city smelled different too. Smoke from factory chimneys mixed now with damp leaves, rain-soaked wood, and the faint earthy scent drifting from parks and countryside roads beyond the crowded districts. The industrial world continued moving without pause. Factories still roared before dawn. Markets still filled with shouting and wagon wheels. Ships still arrived through gray river fog carrying cargo from distant places. But autumn softened the light somehow. The evenings darkened earlier. Golden sunlight briefly touched the upper windows of brick buildings before disappearing behind clouds and smoke. Workers leaving factories at dusk often walked home beneath skies already turning deep blue. Children carried their exhaustion through these fading afternoons quietly. Many no longer remembered another kind of life. The factory bells had shaped nearly every day they could clearly recall. Seasons changed around them, but the rhythm of labor remained almost identical. Wake before sunrise. Work until evening. Return home tired. Sleep. Begin again. And yet autumn carried a certain calmness even within the industrial cities. Rain tapped gently against factory windows while machines thundered inside. Fog drifted through the streets at dawn, muffling sounds and softening the edges of buildings. Market lanterns glowed warmly against the early darkness while vendors arranged vegetables, bread, fish, and apples beneath damp canvas coverings. Children working in those markets moved through familiar routines. Sweeping muddy floors. Hauling baskets. Stacking crates. Delivering goods through narrow streets crowded with workers rushing toward factories before the morning whistles ended. The work often felt colder now. Fingers stiffened in the wind. Wet clothing stayed damp longer during the shorter days. Some children wrapped newspapers inside worn shoes for extra warmth while walking through rain-soaked streets before dawn. In textile mills, the return of cooler weather brought little relief. The factories remained hot from machinery and crowded bodies. Dust floated thickly through the air while gas lamps flickered against windows darkened by rain and smoke. Children leaned close to machines hour after hour, their faces pale beneath harsh indoor light. Some coughed constantly now. Others developed sore joints or headaches from long years spent standing inside overheated rooms with poor air. Doctors visiting industrial districts often described children who looked strangely old for their age. Thin shoulders. Serious expressions. Hands roughened by labor. Bodies shaped more by exhaustion than growth. Yet many children themselves rarely complained openly. Hardship had become ordinary. And ordinary suffering often disappears quietly into the background of daily life. Older workers sometimes noticed the change more clearly than the children did. A mother watching her son fall asleep immediately after supper every night. A father realizing his daughter's hands already looked like those of an adult worker. A grandmother remembering village childhoods filled with fields, rivers, and outdoor play far removed from factories and crowded streets. The transformation of childhood happened slowly enough that many people understood it only after years had already passed. In mining villages, autumn brought cold rain and deep mud. The roads between houses and mine entrances became dark rivers of wet earth beneath endless gray skies. Coal dust mixed with rainwater until entire streets looked black. Children walked through that mud before sunrise carrying lamps that flickered weakly against the wind. Then they descended underground once again. The mines felt unchanged by season. Deep beneath the earth, there was no autumn sunlight. No falling leaves. No cool evening air. Only darkness. Damp stone. Heavy breathing. The scraping sound of wheels moving through narrow tunnels. Children working there sometimes lost track of weather entirely except for the cold waiting outside after long shifts ended. Emerging from the mines at dusk could feel strange during autumn. The sky above appeared enormous after hours underground. Smoke drifted low beneath fading light while rain tapped softly against rooftops and puddles. Many young miners walked home silently, too tired even for conversation. Their bodies ached from lifting, pulling, crawling, breathing coal dust hour after hour. Yet at home, life continued with small familiar routines offering comfort against the harshness outside. Wet boots drying beside weak fires. Soup warming slowly in iron pots. Mothers sewing torn clothing beneath candlelight. Children sleeping close together while wind rattled the windows through the night. These ordinary domestic moments became deeply important because they created warmth in lives often filled with coldness elsewhere. In wealthier homes, autumn unfolded gently. Fires burned in polished fireplaces long before working families could afford enough coal for comfort. Thick curtains kept out the evening chill. Lamps glowed softly beside bookshelves and piano music drifting through quiet rooms. Children there returned to lessons after summer holidays. Tutors arrived carrying books and papers beneath dry coats. Girls practiced handwriting while rain moved softly across tall windows. Boys studied maps, languages, history, and mathematics beside warm fires. Some children collected fallen leaves during walks through gardens or parks untouched by factory smoke. Others read stories aloud while servants prepared tea in quiet kitchens hidden below the main rooms of the house. Yet even here, labor remained close by. A servant girl carried heavy coal buckets upstairs before dawn. A young kitchen worker scrubbed pots in steaming water while hearing laughter drift faintly from family dining rooms overhead. The divide between protected childhood and working childhood remained visible everywhere. As the century continued, schools slowly became more common in certain industrial cities. Not for everyone. Not yet. But enough that some children experienced different routines than their parents once had. A few attended school during mornings before working afternoons. Others learned basic reading and writing in evening classes opened by churches or charities after factory shifts ended. These classrooms often felt small and crowded. Children arrived tired from labor, hands stained with grease, coal dust, ink, or fabric dye. Some struggled to keep their eyes open beneath dim lamplight while teachers explained letters, numbers, and geography. Yet many children desperately wanted to learn. Books offered glimpses of worlds beyond factories and mines. Oceans, mountains, ancient kingdoms, forests, strange animals, distant countries. For exhausted young workers, education sometimes felt like opening a tiny window inside a crowded room. A different life briefly visible beyond the glass. Still, school remained impossible for millions of children whose families needed every hour of labor they could provide. And so two versions of childhood slowly grew side by side during the 19th century. One centered around education, protection, and gradual preparation for adulthood. The other shaped almost entirely by work. The difference between them often depended upon money more than anything else. At harvest time, rural children entered their busiest weeks of the year. Fields glowed gold beneath pale autumn sunlight while entire families worked from dawn until darkness gathering crops before colder weather arrived. The labor felt endless. Wheat cutting, apple gathering, potato digging, corn hauling. Hands became rough and cracked from cold mornings and constant work. Shoulders burned with exhaustion by evening. Dust from dry fields clung to clothing and skin beneath layers of sweat and dirt. Yet harvest also carried moments of shared purpose. Families worked together closely. Neighbors helped one another finish difficult tasks before rain arrived. Large meals appeared after long days outdoors. Children often remembered autumn harvests vividly later in life. The smell of apples stored in wooden barns. Smoke rising into cold evening air. Lantern light moving across fields after sunset. The sound of wagons returning home slowly beneath the stars. Rural labor remained difficult, but nature still shaped its rhythm. Industrial labor often ignored nature completely. Factories demanded the same pace regardless of weather, season, or sunlight. That constant unchanging rhythm exhausted people deeply over time. Especially children. At night, industrial cities looked almost dreamlike during autumn fog. Gas lamps glowed softly through drifting mist while horse hooves echoed against wet stones. Factory windows shone beside rivers moving black beneath bridges lined with smoke-darkened buildings. Children walked home through those streets carrying the weight of another completed day. Some paused briefly beside newspaper stands reading headlines they barely understood. Others hurried through rain hoping to reach warmth before the cold settled deeper into their bones. Inside crowded apartments, evenings became quieter as darkness arrived earlier each week. Families gathered close together beneath candlelight while wind moved softly outside. The room smelled of soup, damp clothing, smoke, and tired bodies finally resting after long labor. Children mended clothes. Parents counted coins carefully. Babies slept against mothers' shoulders. Sometimes someone sang quietly. Not loudly. Not joyfully. Just softly enough to comfort the room for a little while. Music often survived where comfort did not. Old folk songs carried from villages long ago. Religious hymns. Simple lullabies. Melodies remembered from childhoods already fading into memory. Children listening half asleep beside weak fires absorbed those songs deeply. Even exhausted lives still held traces of gentleness. And perhaps that gentleness became more precious because hardship surrounded it constantly. Outside, rain drifted across rooftops while leaves gathered silently along the empty streets. The city slowly settled into darkness beneath smoke-filled skies. Factories quieted one by one. Trains moved through distant stations carrying workers, coal, letters, and goods into the cold night. And high above everything, above the labor, the poverty, the crowded rooms, the endless machinery, the stars remained calm and distant, shining softly over a world where childhood continued slipping away one ordinary season at a time. As the years passed, the industrial cities grew larger and louder. Entire neighborhoods spread outward beside rivers, railroads, and factory districts where smoke rose endlessly into pale skies. New buildings appeared quickly, often faster than roads or clean water systems could properly support them. Streets once lined with small houses became crowded with narrow apartment blocks filled with workers arriving from villages, farms, and distant countries searching for wages. And among them came children. Always children. Some arrived holding tightly to their mothers' hands while staring wide-eyed at the enormous city surrounding them. Others carried bundles of clothing tied in cloth over their shoulders after long journeys by train or wagon. Many had never seen factories before. The cities must have felt overwhelming at first. The noise alone could exhaust a person. Steam whistles echoing across rooftops. Wheels rattling over stone roads. Voices shouting in crowded markets. Dogs barking through narrow alleys. Metal striking metal from workshops that seemed never to sleep. At night, even after the factories quieted, the city still breathed restlessly beneath the darkness. For poor families arriving there, childhood often disappeared quickly. A boy helping unload wagons within weeks of arriving. A girl sewing in crowded rooms beside older women before she had fully grown tall enough for the chair. A younger child caring for babies while parents worked long shifts elsewhere. The city demanded usefulness from everyone. Especially the poor. Inside overcrowded apartments, life became organized around labor schedules. One family might rise before dawn for factory shifts while another returned home from overnight work just as morning arrived. Footsteps moved constantly through stairwells smelling of damp wood, soup, coal smoke, and laundry drying indoors. Children slept wherever space allowed. Several sharing mattresses. Others curled beneath tables or beside kitchen stoves after the fires burned low. Privacy barely existed. Exhaustion belonged to everyone. And still, ordinary family life continued quietly inside these crowded spaces. Mothers patched torn coats beneath candlelight. Fathers shaved before cracked mirrors while children still slept nearby. Babies cried in the darkness. Soup simmered slowly while rain tapped against the windows. The small rituals of care remained steady even when the world outside felt harsh and mechanical. In factories, children became part of enormous systems of production most barely understood. Cotton arrived from distant lands. Coal traveled by train from deep mines. Iron moved through furnaces glowing red beneath the night sky. Inside mills and workshops, young workers repeated tiny tasks thousands of times each day, helping create products shipped far across oceans and continents. A child tying broken threads inside a noisy textile mill could not easily imagine where the finished fabric might eventually go. Perhaps into wealthy homes. Perhaps onto ships. Perhaps into stores filled with clothing far too expensive for working families themselves. Industrial life connected distant worlds together while often keeping workers trapped inside very small ones. Some children spent nearly every waking hour inside only a few streets between home and workplace. The factory. The market. The apartment. The nearby bakery or water pump. Life narrowed into survival routines repeated endlessly. And yet imagination still survived. Children stared into shop windows dreaming quietly about books, toys, cakes, or polished shoes displayed behind the glass. They listened to travelers speaking unfamiliar languages near train stations and wondered about distant places. They watched birds crossing smoky skies above rooftops and paused briefly despite their exhaustion. The human mind keeps searching for softness even during difficult lives. In schools slowly opening across industrial cities, teachers noticed how tired working children often appeared. Some students arrived after already completing morning labor. Others fought sleep through evening lessons held after factory shifts ended. Ink-stained fingers rested against weary faces while teachers explained reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography beneath dim lamps flickering softly against classroom walls. The rooms themselves remained simple. Wooden desks scratched by years of use. Cold floors during winter. Windows fogged from too many bodies crowded together. Yet for many children, these classrooms offered rare quietness. A place briefly separated from machinery, shouting, lifting, carrying, and endless repetition. Books carried particular power then. Stories about distant forests, oceans, ancient kingdoms, explorers, and strange animals opened worlds far larger than the neighborhood surrounding them. Children who spent entire days in factories sometimes listened to readings with deep stillness, imagining places untouched by smoke or labor. Teachers occasionally described students falling asleep over open books simply from exhaustion. Not laziness. Only fatigue layered deeply into growing bodies. Some reformers believed education alone could restore childhood. But reality remained more complicated. A child working 12 hours each day had little energy left for learning afterward. Hunger distracted concentration. Illness interrupted attendance. Families moved often searching for better wages or cheaper housing. And still, small progress continued slowly. Some factories shortened hours for younger workers. Some cities required basic schooling. Some parents, when possible, tried desperately to keep younger children away from labor a little longer than earlier generations had. The change moved quietly through ordinary decisions. A mother insisting her youngest daughter attend school instead of entering the mill immediately. A father taking extra shifts so his son could continue studying another year. Sacrifices made privately without speeches or recognition. In rural communities, childhood also shifted during these years, though more gradually. Machines slowly entered farming life too. Railroads connected remote villages to growing markets. New agricultural tools changed how quickly certain tasks could be completed. Some farming families prospered slightly while others struggled against debt, changing prices, and poor harvests. Children on farms continued working hard, but ideas about schooling and childhood reached the countryside as well. Village schools appeared in more places. Teachers encouraged literacy. Religious groups promoted education for both boys and girls. Still, labor remained central to rural life. A child might spend the morning in school and the afternoon carrying water, feeding animals, repairing fences, or helping gather crops beneath cold autumn rain. Responsibility never disappeared completely. It simply shifted shape little by little. In mining regions, however, childhood remained especially fragile. The mines consumed bodies slowly. Coal dust settled deep into lungs. Injuries happened suddenly and often. Families depended heavily upon every wage earned underground. Children there learned seriousness early. Danger surrounded daily life too closely for long innocence. A tunnel collapse. An explosion. Flooding underground. These fears moved quietly through mining communities constantly. Women waited anxiously during storms. Children listened for distant warning bells. Entire villages gathered silently when accidents occurred. And afterward, life usually continued because survival required it. The 19th century carried enormous strength and enormous exhaustion at the same time. Railroads crossed continents. Factories produced mountains of goods. Cities expanded endlessly. Yet millions of ordinary people experienced this progress mainly through fatigue. Long shifts. Crowded housing. Physical strain. Children growing older too quickly beneath the demands of industrial life. At night, after exhausting days finally ended, the streets filled again with workers moving homeward beneath gas lamps glowing softly through fog. Some evenings brought rain drifting gently over rooftops while wagon wheels splashed through puddles beside crowded sidewalks. Other nights remained clear and cold with stars barely visible beyond smoke hanging over the city. Children walked beside parents or older siblings carrying empty lunch tins, work tools, bundles of cloth, or simply their own exhaustion. Conversations often remained quiet after long shifts. The body saved energy where it could. Yet sometimes children still laughed suddenly at small things. A dog chasing pigeons across the square. Someone slipping harmlessly in the mud. A street musician playing cheerful melodies near the market. Brief sparks of childhood still appeared unexpectedly. And perhaps that made them feel even more precious. Inside homes, evenings unfolded gently despite hardship. Mothers brushed dust from children's hair before bed. Fathers removed heavy boots and stretched aching legs beside weak fires. Older sisters mended clothing while younger brothers slept nearby already dreaming. Candlelight flickered softly against tired faces. Outside, wind moved through narrow streets carrying distant factory sounds fading slowly into the night. These domestic moments formed the quiet center of life for many families. Not work itself. Not industry. Not politics. But the small tenderness waiting afterward. A warm bowl of soup shared between siblings. A blanket adjusted carefully during the night. Someone whispering good night in the darkness. Even exhausted parents tried to create safety where they could. And children remembered those efforts deeply. Because love often becomes clearest during difficult years. The industrial world could feel enormous and uncaring, yet inside tiny apartments people continued protecting one another in ordinary ways. A mother saving the softest piece of bread for her youngest child. An older brother walking his sister home through dangerous streets after late shifts. Neighbors watching one another's children while illness spread through the building. Communities survived partly through these quiet acts invisible to history books. As autumn deepened again, cold rain returned to the city. Leaves gathered beside train tracks and factory walls darkened by smoke. Fog rolled low over rivers where barges moved silently through the gray morning light. Children woke before sunrise once more. The cycle continued. Another season. Another year. Another generation growing older beneath labor. And somewhere far away from the industrial cities, beyond the crowded streets and roaring factories, ancient rivers still flowed calmly beneath moonlight while reeds bent softly in the warm night wind, untouched by whistles, smoke, and the endless machinery of the modern age. There were moments, even in the busiest industrial cities, when the world became strangely quiet. Usually this happened very late at night. The factories slowed one by one. The heavy pounding of machines faded into distant echoes drifting across rooftops. Horses resting in stables stamped softly against wooden floors. Rainwater moved quietly along gutters beneath dim gas lamps trembling in the wind. In those hours, the city almost seemed tired. Exhausted in the same way its workers were exhausted. Inside crowded buildings, children finally slept after another long day of labor. Some dreamed deeply from pure fatigue. Others shifted restlessly beneath thin blankets while distant noises from the streets drifted through cracked windows. A train whistle far away. Footsteps in the stairwell. A baby crying briefly before silence returned. The breathing of family members asleep nearby. For many working children, these nighttime hours were the only true moments of stillness they experienced. Daylight belonged to labor. Darkness belonged to rest. And rest often felt too short. Before dawn, mothers moved quietly through the rooms again preparing for another day. Candles flickered softly against walls stained by smoke and dampness. Bread was sliced carefully. Coats still wet from yesterday's rain were lifted beside weak fires hoping for a little warmth before morning. Children woke slowly. The body sometimes resisted movement after years of exhaustion. A deep heaviness settled into muscles and bones from constant labor. Some children stretched aching backs before standing. Others coughed into cloths darkened faintly by soot and dust from factory air. Yet they rose. Again and again. Because the world around them expected it. Outside, the city waited beneath fog and cold air. Street sweepers already worked beneath gas lamps, pushing mud and horse manure toward drains clogged with rainwater and ash. Bakers carried trays of bread from hot ovens into storefronts glowing warmly before sunrise. Dock workers crossed bridges toward the harbor where ships waited silently in the darkness. Children joined the movement of workers flowing steadily through the streets. Thousands of tired footsteps beginning another day together. Some children walked alone by then. Old enough to know the route without guidance. Young enough to still feel frightened sometimes in the darkness before dawn. Industrial cities could feel lonely despite their crowds. People moved quickly. Spoke briefly. Protected their own energy carefully after long hours of work. And yet small kindnesses still appeared unexpectedly. A baker handing a hungry child an extra crust of bread. An older worker helping a younger one across icy streets. A woman adjusting another child's scarf against the cold while passing through the market. Tiny moments of care passed quietly between strangers sharing the same difficult world. Inside factories, the air felt stale even before the workday fully began. Gas lamps burned against the dim morning light while machines trembled slowly awake. Children took their places beside spinning frames, looms, furnaces, presses, or work tables already scarred by years of labor. The sounds returned immediately. Metal rattling. Belts turning overhead. Steam hissing through pipes. Voices raised above the machinery. The factories swallowed silence completely. Children learned to communicate through gestures and quick glances because conversation became nearly impossible inside the noise. They watched one another carefully for signs of danger, mistakes, or exhaustion. Some workers moved almost mechanically after enough years passed. Hands performing familiar tasks automatically while minds drifted elsewhere. Toward memories. Toward dreams. Toward nothing at all. Fatigue can empty the mind until only movement remains. Yet even inside those harsh environments, children noticed beauty sometimes. Sunlight breaking briefly through dirty windows. Snow falling outside beyond the factory glass. A bird landing on the windowsill before flying away again. The smell of rain arriving after long summer heat. These small details interrupted the machinery of daily life for a moment. Perhaps they reminded children that another world still existed beyond work. In sewing rooms across the city, young girls bent over fabric beneath weak afternoon light while autumn rain tapped steadily against the windows. Needles flashed between tired fingers. Thread rolled across tables. Scissors scraped softly through cloth. The rooms often felt quieter than factories, but no less exhausting. Hours passed slowly there. Shoulders stiffened. Eyes burned from concentration. Backs curved painfully from leaning forward too long. Some girls began sewing so young that they could hardly remember learning how. The skill simply became part of their bodies. Like breathing. Like walking. Like enduring. During meal breaks, workers sometimes gathered near windows or doorways searching for fresh air. Bread and tea appeared from cloth bundles carried from home. Conversations remained soft and brief. Many people conserved energy carefully. But occasionally stories emerged. Someone remembering village life before moving to the city. Someone describing the ocean after working aboard ships. Someone speaking about children lost to illness years earlier. Life moved close to grief in the 19th century. Disease remained everywhere. Especially among the poor. Tuberculosis, influenza, scarlet fever, cholera, pneumonia illnesses drifted constantly through crowded neighborhoods where entire families shared small rooms with poor ventilation and little medical care. Children weakened by labor often became vulnerable first. A simple cough sometimes deepened slowly over months until parents began worrying silently each night while listening to difficult breathing beside them in the dark. Doctors could offer little help for many illnesses. Medicine remained limited. And treatment often cost more than poor families could afford anyway. So mothers relied on warm soup, herbs, rest when possible, cool cloths against fevered skin, whispered prayers, and hope. Sometimes children recovered. Sometimes they faded quietly despite every effort surrounding them. The city itself rarely paused for morning. Factory whistles still sounded before dawn. Markets still opened. Ships still unloaded cargo. The industrial world kept moving forward regardless of private sorrow unfolding behind apartment windows. Perhaps this constant motion made childhood feel even more fragile. There was so little time for gentleness before responsibility arrived. In wealthier homes, however, the idea of childhood continued growing softer and more protected. Nurseries filled with toys and books became symbols of good family life. Parents increasingly believed children should be guided carefully through stages of development instead of pushed directly into adult labor. Painters showed peaceful scenes of children reading beside fireplaces or playing in gardens beneath afternoon sunlight. Writers described innocence as precious and delicate. Schools expanded further for middle-class families. Music lessons. Drawing lessons. Language studies. Long walks through clean parks. These childhoods existed almost like separate worlds compared to factory districts only streets away. A wealthy child practicing piano while rain moved softly against tall windows. A working child hauling coal through muddy alleys in the same storm. The contrast shaped the century deeply. And slowly, society began noticing the contradiction more clearly. Reformers visited factories documenting dangerous conditions. Journalists wrote about exhausted young workers laboring through the night. Photographers captured solemn faces staring directly into the camera beneath layers of dust and fatigue. These images carried quiet power. People could no longer easily imagine industrial childhood as temporary or harmless after seeing the children themselves. Still, change remained painfully slow. Laws passed gradually. Some employers ignored them. Some families still needed every wage